Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Assembly Committee on Ways and Means and Senate Committee on Finance, Subcommittee on K-12, Higher Education, and CIP. Will the Secretary please call the roll?
Senators Buck, Canizaro, Scheibel, Stone, Dondero Loop, Assembly Members Hafen, Haudegi, Koenig, Monroe Moreno, O'Neill, Torres Fawcett, Yeager, and Chair Backus.
And I am present. Please mark Senator Canizaro present when she arrives. With that, today's agenda includes Nevada System of Higher Education, covering a variety of budget items. And for today's presentation, we're okay if you go ahead and do your complete presentation. We will ask questions at the end. And then after we're done with NCHI's presentation, we will, of course, have public comment. And for those that may be listening online and wish to call in to participate in public comment, today's telephone number is 775-684-6903. And go ahead and please listen to the prompts when you are prompted. And with that, we'll go ahead and open the budget hearing for the Nevada System of Higher Education. And there's a lot of budget numbers listed on today's agenda that we will be hearing. So welcome.
Okay, good morning, and thank you so much, Chair Backus, Chair Dondero Loop, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Patty Charlton, and I'm the Chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education. It is a pleasure to be with you here today, and thank you for the wonderful weather, by the way. Heard it's going to change in the next couple days, but we really appreciate that. And so I'm joined at the table today, and the primary presentation will be done by myself and CFO Chris Fatone, but we also have representatives from every one of our institutions, several in many cases, as we wrap up this presentation, should you have questions. But we do really want to thank you in advance again for the time today, and also for all the work that the legislature is doing and for your support of higher education. And so with that, let's get started. So first, just a quick overview of the process, and what we're going to cover for you today is I'm also joined by Patty Porter with Nevada WICHE. As you know, Nevada WICHE is an independent agency, and at NCHI we work closely together, but primarily providing support for WICHE. I'm going to then provide an overview of our organization structure, our enrollment, how we have progressed in making good successes and outcomes. Obviously, there's work to be done. And then we're going to also review the sources and uses of funds within the Nevada System of Higher Education, and then also move into the governor's recommended NCHI budget. And so with that, I'm going to turn it to Patty Porter.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Chair Backus and Chair Dondero Loop, and also legislators. My name is Patty Porter. I'm the director of the Nevada office of WICHE. You may know WICHE as, well, to be honest with you, a lot of people, when I talk about WICHE, they go, WICHE? Is that the one in Colorado? I go, no, we're actually the Nevada office of WICHE. We are an independent, so there's 3 commissioners are appointed by the governor per NRS 397, and then and I serve at their pleasure. I'm appointed by them. So I, as a director, presenting to you our budget this morning. So first of all, I want to talk about the 3 programs. We have 3 programs now at WICHE. One is the Professional Student Exchange Program, which is in exchange for tuition support, graduate students study in healthcare fields for occupational therapy, physical therapy, physician assistant, pharmacy, and veterinary medicine, with Nevada workforce shortages commit to serving in the state of Nevada. Typically, for each year that a participant receives a stipend, they owe 1 year to the state of Nevada as a service payback. The program works in collaboration, like I mentioned, with Regional WICHE, which is based out of Colorado, and we work together to select the stipends there. Regional WICHE is the one that has the agreements with the institutions where the Nevada students could be attending. The second program is the Health Profession Education Program, or what we call HPEP. So in exchange for tuition support, graduate students in the fields of advanced practice nursing, masters of social work, and undergraduate students in the field of RN to BSN commit to, practicing, this time, though, in a medically underserved area in Nevada for each year that they receive a stipend. And then the third program, which is new, you may have remembered in June of 2023, Senate Bill, many of you actually, thank you, because you had a part of making that happen. Senate Bill 342, the Nevada Office of WICHE was directed to enter into a contract with USU for $8 million to provide a stipend to reduce the cost of attendance, the difference between the cost of attendance between in and out of state tuition for 70 residents of the state of Nevada to earn a doctorate of veterinary medicine, or DVM, from the College of Veterinary Medicine at USU. The time range for that, it starts July 1 of 2024 to June 30, 2034. The contract was approved by the Interim Finance Committee in June of 2024, and currently USU is in the process of attaining their provisional accreditation from the American Veterinary Medical Association Council of Education for a fall 2025 start. So those are our three programs. Also, just to highlight, my office actually pays the membership fee for Nevada in the Western Regional Compact. So that is a big part that comes out of our budget to pay for that membership fee, and that provides benefits such as WUI. Most people know WUI, the Western Undergraduate Exchange Program, where students can go in the compact states and get a discounted tuition. Also, there is another version called Western Regional Graduate Program, or WRGP. Again, good thing to get out there, because I don't think a lot of people know that there is an actual version of WUI for graduate students where they can go for reduced tuition in the compact states. And then the last thing is we have a psychology internship consortia that we're involved with, the Department of Public and Behavioral Health and Regional WICHE. We provide stipends for 3 postdoc psychology interns, and they work mostly in your forensic hospitals to get that training and support that. So those are the services that we provide. I think the next slide, you have this information already, but for our next biennial budget, we have, these are the slots that we're funding for PSAP, and 36 for 26 for PSAP, and 36 for FY27 in those areas. I have to emphasize the areas are occupational therapy, physical therapy, PA, veterinary medicine, and pharmacy. Veterinary medicine, only 4 slots. So not to confuse that with the HPEP program with USU. And then under HPEP, we have 49 slots for each of those areas. And then the transfer to public and behavioral health to fund the 3 intern positions. And then the last slide really was on the information that I had provided you, just to let you know what were our actuals in 23-24, what's our projected for this year, and then for the next biennium. I won't go into detail there, but if you want me to answer questions, I can. And that said, I would like to thank ENCHE, because, again, we have the ENCHE commissioners have a MOU with Nevada System of Higher Education System Administration to provide housing. So they house me at their facility. I have one little office. I'm just me, by the way, one person, and one other temporary person. But they provide housing for us, administrative support. And so, I think on behalf of the commissioners, I'd like to thank ENCHE as well for their partnership and support, and to thank you as well. And to be honest with you, you guys got great LCB people and GFO people, because they've helped me so much when I started this thing. So that said, I am done.
Thank you so much, Ms. Porter. I figured we would stop here just to see if any members had any questions, so you didn't have to sit through the entire next presentation. So with that, members, do we have any questions for Ms. Porter? I will go to Senator Dondero Loop, but before I do that, I just want to say I do agree we have wonderful staff here, and I'm glad they've provided me a lot of help, so I'm glad they've also provided you help, Ms. Porter.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I agree. We have wonderful staff that assists us. Ms. Porter, my question is, from that last slide that you just showed, do every one of those slots get filled? And if so, how many more, if we could just, our wish came true, how many could we fill?
So Director Porter, for the record, yes. So for the 23-24 slots, we were short some. I had started a pilot program called RN to BSN. I think because of the slow start in the information, we didn't get to fill everything. But this year for 24-25, we're on target to fill all our slots, including the RN to BSN program. So I feel pretty confident that, barring any crazy stuff. So that said, that hopefully we will fill also the slots that we have projected for the next biennium. Can we fill more spots? I will tell you, for example, nurse practitioner, I have probably at least a wait list right now of 10 or 12 that I can't, I mean, I'm full. So I usually tell them to stay on the wait list. And if somebody does not commit to my second round, which I'm doing right now, then I'll go on to the list. I also give them resources, by the way. I refer them to like Nevada Heal, which you are familiar with, loan repayment programs with the feds and UNR. There's a program, Nevada Health Corp. So I try to help students because I think there's a lot of information out there, but it's all kind of scattered. So I try to provide that resource to them if I can't help them. So.
Thank you very much. I just think it's important that everybody understands that, I know that we all know that kids need assistance, and this is just one way for them to get that, and it's a great program. So thank you for everything you do, and I appreciate your help with our students.
Okay, thank you. Director Porter-Rucker, thank you very much.
Next, we'll go to Senator Stone.
Thank you for the presentation. It's a great program. I was just curious of the filled slots. They're required to go back to underserved areas and give back service based on the number of stipends that they've gotten. Are we tracking that? How many people actually fulfill their obligations, if you will? And then do we need further tracking to see how many of these people actually end up staying in Nevada, which is certainly the goal?
So Director Porter, for the record, that's a great question, Senator Stone. We do track. So yes, you're right. For every, kind of simple, for either HPEP or PSEP, for every year they get a stipend, they owe a year back. With PSEP and NRS 397, they can serve anywhere in the state of Nevada. With the HPEP program, it's anywhere in an underserved area as defined by HRSA, which is the underserved areas, which, to be honest, there's a lot of underserved areas in Nevada. That's a misnomer. A lot of our students think they have to only go in one area. Yes, but we do track them. The numbers that you're seeing there, we have about 250 what I call active participants who are either in the process of going to school right now or they're actually fulfilling their service payback right now. We are on the process of making sure that they follow up with their practice questionnaires, which is a way that they are required through a contract they sign with us to fulfill that. Now, if they do not fulfill their service obligation within 5 years, or we do have extensions for extenuating circumstances, they don't appeal it, then their stipend will convert to a loan with penalties and interest. So, which it does make for tracking is very heavy, but yeah, we are definitely on top of it. And I will tell you, I don't feel like I'm in the business of making loans. We got rid of loans in 2021, but if we have to, then we will negotiate that. But the goal is really to keep them here and have them stay here. And so the numbers that you're seeing for 2022, 2024 are the ones that we know right now are still in Nevada practicing.
Thank you so much. Members, do we have any other questions for Director Porter? I don't see any other questions, so we will go ahead and move on to NCHE's rest of their budget items on today's agenda.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Backus. And again, for the record, Patty Charlton, Chancellor, Nevada System of Higher Education. So as we move through, just a quick, I'm going to go through some of these slides quite quickly, just a little familiarity. We are governed by a 13-member Board of Regents. As you might recall, in the 2023 legislative session, AB 118 passed, which modified Chapter 72, and so we will be moving, there is a plan to move that member of the Board of Regents down to 9 members from the 13, and their terms will be for 4 years as opposed to what used to be 6 years. We have 7 teaching institutions supporting our over 110,000 credit-based students. Our institutions are listed, and of course we have what we consider the jewel of the desert in Desert Research Institute. little bit more about the system. Some of these names might be new, some might be familiar to you. Our Board of Regents is elected. There are rotating terms. We have some new regents. One of your former colleagues, Pete Gokachia, now serves as a regent on the board. Our newest member, Ms. Jennifer McGrath, was appointed to fill the position that previously was held by Dr. Lois Tarkanian, who's no longer with us, unfortunately. And then we had two other newly elected individuals, Mr. Carlos Fernandez and Mr. Aaron Batista. And so that is our list of our board members. I serve as the chancellor, if you've heard, and then we also have our institutional representatives. Dr. Chris Hebe just joined UNLV as the officer in charge at this time. We've had a transition. I think you're also familiar with the other presidents that we have. And so our mission is very clear. It looks very long, but we are here to educate Nevadans to support Nevada and to produce a workforce for the state. We are guided through the system by NSHE strategic goals as established by the Board of Regents. And again, we are here to graduate students. We want to ensure that we are closing the achievement gap, that every student and everyone, all people, have an opportunity to be successful in their endeavors. Research and development, as you know, we have not one R1 institution, but two. And that is really a testament to the work of this body in working with us to ensure that our two universities could achieve that high recognition of R1 status. Workforce development is at the very core of all that we do, because we really want to ensure that we are supporting the diversification of our economy and producing a workforce for Nevada to support our industries. And then something that I have shared with you, and I think all of us feel very, very deeply about, is to ensure that we have coordination among our institutions. We are accountable to you, we are accountable to the public, we are accountable to our stakeholders, and that we operate in a transparent manner. So a little bit about the trends of our enrollment. We do have our latest enrollments from the fall 2024 semester, and our institutions are going strong. As you'll see, we had a high point of enrollment of just under 115,000 in 2010. That was really during the Great Recession, where traditionally what you see is individuals coming back into higher education to retool, get new skill sets during periods of economic downturn. Another important year to note was 2019. The pandemic did have a significant impact. We were making good progress coming out of the Great Recession. Then the pandemic hit, and it was really a bit chaos, I could say, for our institutions. But all of our institutions are experiencing growth. They have rebounded, and they are doing amazing work within their communities and service areas. A little bit about how that enrollment is dispersed throughout the system. Having been with the system for about 30 years, one of the things we used to always say, I worked at CSN where we had the largest institution. That is not really the case any longer. UNLV is almost 30% of all system headcount, and so you'll see that number at just under 33,000 for the fall of 2024. UNR with 22,331, and that pie chart will show the rest of the distribution. Again, our institutions are going strong with strong enrollments, and we're really grateful for the work that they are doing to outreach to Nevadans. On the right side, you will see what that looks like for full-time equivalent students, and so you'll notice that the percentages do look a little different, and that's probably really a testament to the fact that at our community colleges and at the state university, individuals are more apt to go on a part-time basis. They're working adults, they have other obligations, and so that is our FTE breakdown. And that is, again, for the most recent term, fall of 2024. Moving along to how we are looking on graduation rates. This is going to be divided by sector. So first looking at our universities, and over time, going over the last 20 years, 2023 is the most recent data as we get this information through IPEDS reporting, which is standardized. And so what you'll see is each of our institutions are increasing those graduation rates, and those graduation rates are determined based on the percentage of a first-time full-time degree-seeking student. And so that would be those that finish within that 150%. So for a bachelor's degree, that's 6 years. And so the national average is 63%. And as you can see, our institutions are making amazing stride. And UNR is actually just under the national average. And that's a real testament really to the focus and the work on outcomes and ensuring that all of our students are successful. Also interesting to note on this chart, but when you look at 2003, Nevada State was just an infant at that time. They are now at a 31% graduation rate, and to do that over 20 years is an amazing accomplishment. So moving on to our community colleges, and I am going to just focus on this just briefly because there really is another measure that really is more accurate of the reflection of how community colleges measure success, and that's called the outcomes measure. This is the community colleges using that same definition of that percentage of first-time, full-time degree-seeking student. But again, this is also a very small cohort within our community colleges because so many students go part-time primarily. And so our graduation rates have made improvement. They continue to do that. Our institutions are laser-focused on student success. And so with that, let me show you a different measure that actually includes those first-time and non-first-time, our transfer students, and then those also that are either full or part-time. And so it also measures those students over a longer period, up to 8 years, and then if they are still enrolled at an institution. A stark difference when you really look at the great work that our community colleges are accomplishing. So moving along, just to look at Nevada as a whole, one of the things that's been a priority since we participated in Complete College America is really ensuring that we are providing the support for our Nevadans to increase the amount of post-secondary education. And so what you see here, and ideally we'd like to see the red and the blue lines closer together, or the blue line exceeding the red line, but we have made great strides in the percentage of individuals in Nevada with a degree. And so that's this chart here, and so we're making good progress, but again, that percentage is continuing to go up, and the fact that between 2012 and 2022, that number grew by 5% when you look at our population is significant. Moving along to our pipeline to the workforce, well, we talk about graduation rates and percentages. What we really also know is that we have completers at our institutions that are graduating, and they are staying and they are working within Nevada. And so these are actually the numbers of completers by our institution. And as you can see, these numbers are significantly high percentage growth. In fact, if you look at Nevada State, 200% when you look at where they were in 2011, 2012. The same with UNLV and UNR in the 30s and 40s, but across the board, all of our institutions are graduating record number of students with credentials. And then in work with this body in particular, you have been very focused on the needs of Nevada, and particularly in certain areas such as teachers and nurses. And so through our work together, and we wanted to share with you how we have grown the number of teachers that graduate from our Nevada institutions, and then also those numbers of nurses. And last session, you actually provided funding for us to increase the capacity of nurses. That is not yet fully reflected on this chart, as it did take some time to scale up to hire faculty to get those clinical placements, as well as to ensure that we were recruiting students. I want to touch on the Desert Research Institution. They have been around for 65 years, and were established in 1959, so my math is probably off just a little bit, but they are really solving the environmental challenges and issues, not just in Nevada, not just in the United States, but across the world. And so they have over 600 scientists, engineers. They work with students and staff. They support all of our institutions as well. They have over 52 million in sponsored research awards. Primarily, Desert Research Institution receives a majority of their funding through grants, and they have over 140 PhD faculty in well over 4 disciplines. They operate both in northern Nevada and in southern Nevada, and have a number of specialized laboratories. The next slide is where we stand on the growth of research funding. As I mentioned, we have our 2 R1s plus DRI, and this chart shows a comparison from 2018 to 2022, where we have increased research funding and expenditures over those last 5 years by 20%. And so with that, I'm going to give you a break from my voice, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris Fatone.
Thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Chris Fatone, Chief Financial Officer for the system. And before I cover the system's governor's recommended budget, I wanted to cover a very high-level overview of the system's total comprehensive funding sources and uses. So starting with this slide 23, I think I know our focus here is the governor's recommended budget, and for that is our state-supported accounts. So this pie chart is showing overall the distribution of activity between the state-supported budgets and the other accounts. So when you ask or hear about the system's other accounts, those are the accounts that are outside the state-supported operating budgets, the budgets that are not part of our discussion today. But for this slide, you can see in the state-supported accounts, the sources of funds in those accounts are your general fund appropriation, and then student registration fees and non-resident tuition are the primary sources of other revenue in those accounts. Now, registration fees and student fees live in both sides of this equation. So on the accounts that are outside the state-supported accounts, the registration fee, as you know, is distributed, and we talk about the distribution of the registration fee. The portion outside the state-supported accounts is the capital improvement fee, general improvement fee, student access, so scholarship funds that are set aside out of the registration fee, and then activities and programs. In addition, on the non-state side, you have other fees that are approved for specific purposes, such as differential fees, program fees, special course fees, additional fees that are for specific services for the students. In addition to those activities, you have grant and contract activities, and gift and endowment are primary sources, along with auxiliary services such as housing and dining, athletics, and other events. So I know I just mentioned this on the prior slide, but a summary on the left of the various sources of activity that's outside the state-supported operating budgets, and uses that, as you can see, it's all the same types of functional uses that you see in the state-supported accounts, in addition to the auxiliaries and other support. So that was a high level, just the distribution between the state-supported accounts and non-state accounts. This pie chart is a summary of the actual revenue sources, and this data is from the system's most recently completed audited financial statement. So again, the student fees on the last slide are split between the two sides. In this case, this is just the actual revenue sources, and you can see the largest piece is state general fund, about 33% of the total sources, but followed close second with grants and contracts and tuition and fees and sales and services and so on. And this pie chart is the system's total expenditures. This is all the sources that are contributing to the total expenses. And the largest expense in our budgets is the people delivering the instruction and completing the research. So about 65% of the total budget goes into compensation and benefits, followed by supplies and services, and you can see the other expenses on the chart. And again, overall total size of the system's operation, both revenues and expenses, is about $2.4 billion per year. The next slide is the distribution of the system's total employee full-time equivalents. And I say total. This slide includes academic and administrative faculty, part-time instructors, or we refer to them sometimes as letters of appointment, or LOAs. You might hear those terms interchangeably. And then also, of course, our classified staff and technologists. What's not included in this total is student employment, which includes graduate assistants, medical residents, and other student employees, student workers, and any temporary hourly staff. This is just full-time positions and the part-time instructors. This slide is a distribution of those categories of employee groups by institution, and you can see the heavy reliance that the system has on part-time instructors, significantly so on the two-year institutions. You'll see that distribution noted in red on this pie chart. And this is the same categories of employees from the prior slide. Again, the same categories of employees, those three employee groups. This is the distribution by funding source. So again, the top line, you can see the most significant portion being covered through the state-supported operating budgets. And again, those are the positions that are within the budget accounts that are part of the governor's recommended budget. Again, that 10,513 from fiscal 24 includes the academic and administrative faculty, classified staff and technologists, and the part-time instructors. And then you can see the other categories of funding sources covering positions there as well. And like the slide that showed the distribution of the employee groups by institution, this is that same measure of the data across the various funding sources. And with that, I'll move on to the governor's recommended budget. Slide 32 is a summary of the system's 29 budget accounts and revenue sources. And again, I mentioned this on an earlier slide, but as you can see in this slide, the most significant portion of other revenues besides state general fund appropriation is registration fees and non-resident tuition, in addition to some other minor revenues. Other revenues I'll mention on this slide, you'll see a growth from fiscal year 25 to 26 and 27. The most significant adjustment there is academic support agreements on the UNR Medical School operating budget. Before we talk a little more about the system's recommended budget accounts, I wanted to cover this trend of the system's general fund appropriation. I know you have some interest in, we are a large budget in the state's distribution of allocation of general fund, and I know there's interest in understanding how that proportion has changed over time. So the columns on this chart are the system's share of the state general fund over the past 20 or so year period, ranging from a high there of 21% to a low more recently of 12.7. And some of the lines on the chart are to also provide you, I know you have some interest in the system's history with registration fee increases. And what we have here on the bottom are the registration fee increases for the undergraduate registration fees at the universities and the lower division registration fees at the community college level. You can see in the period of the Great Recession, there was that's a period where the system operating appropriations were reduced rather significantly, and the offset to that was increases in student registration fees, followed by a period where there was great concern with stabilizing the registration fees, and so we lowered on a 2-year basis. There was actually no increase in registration fees. Subsequently, then stabilizing around inflation, and more recently in 2018, the board adopted their predictable pricing policy that set the registration fee increases at inflation using the Common Fund Higher Ed Pricing Index. That policy was adopted in 2018, with the first year that reflected the increase being fiscal year 20. And from there now, the system is publishing their registration fees and non-resident tuition rates 5 years in advance. We actually just used the fiscal year 24 higher ed price index to set the rates for fiscal year 29 that'll be published shortly. So you see that in the end, and then we've also got the system's graduation rates that the Chancellor mentioned earlier. Those are the two lines that you see increasing over time to show those increases. Another view of the system's general fund or state-supported operating budgets and the distribution of the share of revenue between general fund and student fees is on slide 34, with the blue column, the blue colors on the columns being the general fund portion, and the gold color being the registration fees and other revenues. And you see here the the trend over time, with the high of 77.4% over this period and low of 59.4%. Systems average has over this period has been about 67.5%, and that's actually about where we are in the current budget cycles. One more view of relative funding that's outside the state. This is a national comparison, just so you have a sense of where the systems falls in total funding per student FTE when you look at the national landscape. This is total education revenue, so this is both state appropriation and tuition and fees, and it's tuition and fees reduced for scholarships. So it's and that's consistent with all the state reporting on here. This is a chart that's part of an annual publication by the State Higher Ed Finance report. And this is fiscal year 23. It's the most recent data that's published. We expect fiscal year 24 to be released fairly shortly, and we do expect to see Nevada move up in that regard, given the large salary adjustments that were approved in 23 for fiscal year 24. With that, I'd like to move on to review the system's governor's recommended budget and talk about the maintenance and enhancement decision units that are in the budget. So slide 36 is a summary of all the maintenance and enhancement decision units, and you'll notice the maintenance units are primarily associated with utility inflation, our caseload adjustment, fringe benefit inflation, and other caseload adjustments related to the formula budget accounts. We did, as you are aware, there were two maintenance. There was a maintenance adjustment and an enhancement adjustment moved to the to one-shot funding. Those are reflected at the bottom of the slide. The one enhancement remaining in the recurring is or two, I should say, are related to the formula committee recommendations, and we'll cover those later in the presentation. So reviewing the more detail on each of the maintenance units, the first is the utility inflation. This represents the difference between the actual incurred utility expenses in fiscal year 24 and the legislatively approved budgets. And this was an exercise we worked through with the Governor's Finance Office to develop these figures that are included for your consideration. Maintenance decision units M200 and M202 are related to a formula adjustment for caseload related to research O&M space at the two R1 universities. Each cycle, as part of that adjustment, we're looking at the average cost per square foot of maintenance on the two university campuses and the dedicated research space square footage. And this adjustment is to contribute to the investment in research, recognizing that the dedicated research space is not part of the instructional space that is factored into the weighted student credit hour equation. So I know I'm getting into a little bit of detail on the formula components as talking through these, and I'm happy to get into more detail on those if you have questions about those adjustments. But the M202 adjustment is new in this cycle, and that was something that we identified in preparing the budget request this year, that the dedicated research space adjustment in the past, the M200, was focused on dedicated research space in the formula budget accounts. There was not a similar recognition of the dedicated research space in the non-formula accounts. And so we worked with both UNR and UNLV to confirm the dedicated research space in their non-formula budgets and presented initially a maintenance adjustment for that space on the same basis as the M200. Working with your staff following our pre-session hearing, there's a technical adjustment on that M202 that's reduced it from the initial recommended amount to the number on this slide, just ensuring there's not an overlap between this request and a recharge budget in the non-formula accounts. And again, I mentioned this adjustment you see is only on UNR space. That's not because we didn't look. That's only because UNLV does not have dedicated research space in their non-formula accounts. So there was not a similar need to address that in the request. Moving on to the next maintenance adjustment, this is the M201, is the small institution factor. Again, as part of the formula that's been in place since 2013, recognizing that the smaller institutions, the weighted student credit hour model did not adequately address the challenge of funding administrative costs due to the economies of scale. The small institution factor is an adjustment that is providing for additional funding to the extent that the institution's weighted student credit hours fall below 100,000 weighted student credit hours for the year. This cycle is the first cycle Western Nevada actually exceeded that 100,000 threshold, and so this adjustment drops their small institution factor to 0. We'll talk more about this in the Formula Committee's recommendations when we get to that. Slide 40 is the systems maintenance adjustment related to the weighted student credit hours, and I know I've been mentioning that several times already in the presentation. To back up a little bit and explain the weighted student credit hour, you're familiar with students' registration for courses. They earn credit hours as part of that course completion. The credit hour is the measure of the time of instruction. The difference between the credit hour and the weighted student credit hour is a weighting factor that's a cost-informed weight intended to account for the difference in the cost of delivery of instruction for different types of courses based on their classification of instruction. And so each cycle, the institution's credit hours are summarized. We exclude non-resident completions. We also exclude credit hours associated with F grades and withdrawals. And so you're left with resident student credit hours excluding F grades and withdrawals. Those weighted credit hours are compared to our prior caseload measurement date, and the increase or decrease is then applied to the cost per weighted student credit hour that's derived from the last budget cycle. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about Maintenance Unit 204. Maintenance Unit 204 is new this cycle also. This was an adjustment that was identified as a concern related to the manner in which the weighted student credit hour has traditionally been developed on the prior closing appropriation balances, and that concern arose over the cost of living adjustments that were part of the last cycle's closing but don't factor into the weighted student credit hour value. I'll discuss that more when we get to the one-shot appropriations, as that maintenance adjustment was one of the amendments that was moved to one-shot funding. And with that, I'll turn it back to the Chancellor for the Formula Committee.
Thank you. For the record, Patty Charlton. And so now I would like to kind of walk through at a high level before CFO Vitone goes through the numbers and the details of the recommendation that came forward from an interim study on the funding formula. And so really wanted to thank also several members of this body, include Senator Dondero Loop, Senator Buck, for participating as members of this body during the Higher Education Funding Committee work. And so this was an interim study that included representation from the governor's office, from your body, some community members as well, but then also had representation in an advisory capacity from staff, as well as from our presidents and our students within our system in our institution. And so, Chris, next, thanks. And so, thank you. So we have recommended, so as the committee completed their work, one of the things that we noted is that in any distribution type model, there would be winners and losers. And we recognize that the state has come a long way in the matter of achieving the R1 status. Our formula that we currently have that is in place really recognized that and shored up the resources that were necessary at UNR and UNLV to achieve that R1 status. That is really important and significant for our state, and we recognize that. But where we really struggled is that our community colleges and our state university were really left behind in that factor. We also recognize that the formula had not kept pace with some inflationary issues, particularly as it pertains to our small institutions. And so we have asked for a phase-in of this formula, and with a small amount in year one of the biennium of FY26 and of 20%, and in FY27 of 40%, then moving into the future biennium, looking to shore that up. But the purpose really was to ensure that we weren't causing harm to the great work that had been accomplished, but recognize the need of our institutions. And so on the next slide, I'm going to just walk through. I know this print is very small, so apologize. I did step into the role as chancellor at the end of August of 23, really in September of 23, and much of this work had already been accomplished with Assembly Bill 493 that was passed last session. The system thanks the legislature for a $2 million appropriation, but on a positive note, we did give about $1.5 million back just because the expenditures were lower than what we had anticipated doing, performing that study. And so it was a study that was put to NSHE to perform. And so with that, the former chancellor drafted a charge for that committee. We did make some adjustments along the way in conversation with both the legislature as well as the governor's office on things that could or could not be done. For example, there was... Okay. There was a perspective that in the original charge it included a review of governance. However, that was noted to not have been included in the bill, so governance was removed from that charge. So really, the committee was charged to evaluate models for higher ed funding that are used in other states to support institutions similar to Nevada, and to compare those to our current funding, including the allocation methodology and the cost to deliver instruction. Also to look at whether other funding allocation methods would be appropriate for NSHE, whereby different missions of research universities, state universities, and community colleges are appropriately considered. And then to make those recommendations regarding those methods used in other states for how we capture and report revenue and expenditures outside of a state-supported operating budget. Some of that work was also previously conducted and performed based on an LCB audit that occurred, and so several recommendations came forward to the system. I believe between the 21-22 year, those have been implemented, and we've increased reporting significantly through both policy and through reporting to the board and other bodies. So really where the work came through in this work in the funding formula space was really looking at a best practice and what a growing trend is, and that's focusing on several different factors. The core cost of instruction, the enrollment, the FTE, the head count, those credit hours, which we've already talked about just a little bit, so using some of what we already include, but it also did not recognize the differential of students. So looking at our full-time and part-time students, those students that traditionally have not participated in higher education, and then those that also are seeking a higher credentialing. And then also looking at that mission differentiation, which we see in our community college as well. And so then also looking at an outcomes base where it's a balanced approach. So next, just as a quick comparison, and we also looked at this work during our study, and it was they were very long meetings, so your colleagues were, get the hats off to them for sticking through 8 to 10 hour meetings when we met. We looked at the appropriations per FTE for both our 2-year institutions and our 4-year institutions, both over time, looking at it from 2022 to 2023 for both our 2-year institutions in Nevada as well as in the U.S. And again, there is a bit of a lag in the data, as CFO Vitone mentioned, and so we're just waiting for SHIO to update their 2024 numbers, and we'd be happy to bring updated figures back to this body to show, because we do think that we have made some progress, particularly because of the significant cost of living awards that were appropriated. As we worked through our work, the formula does recommend maintaining those direct allocations for both the small institution factor, which supports both the Western Nevada College and Great Basin, and then also to continue the research facilities and O&M, again, for that work around our research mission. And so that is a set aside from the formula that is put into place first. And so a significant recommendation that came from the committee is those direct allocations for both Great Basin and Western, as I highlighted those. As I mentioned, and CFO Vitone mentioned, the current formula takes a threshold of 100,000 weighted student credit hour. And so the recommendation from the committee was to increase that from 100,000 to 125,000, and also take back and a charge to the chancellor's office with the institutions and our institutional research to see if those weighted student credit hours are really the right measure to determining the complexities of a small institution. And so prior to the 27 session, we will be coming back with some outcomes of that study. Should we be looking at headcount, for example, rather than just weighted student credit hour? Another recommendation that was included is that the value that was assigned to each of those credit hours was actually it did not change over 10 years, and we certainly know that inflation and the cost has changed. And so the recommendation, we have maintained a $30 per student credit hour value to that, but now the recommendation is to tie that to the HEPI index. And so for this specific request, it would actually increase it because of that 10-year plus time frame from $30 to $40, but we would also mix that and tie it and connect that to the HEPI index moving through the future. And so in summary, just a comparison of how the funding was under the 2013 formula. That is on the left, where 100% of the funding was allocated just purely based on the weighted student credit hour, didn't take into consideration full-time, part-time students that might need a little bit extra assistance. And so there was also the performance earn back allocation of 20%. That is now blended into the recommendations, and so that's what you see on the right, where we would now base the allocation of the formula based on 75% of that weighted student credit hour, 10% focused on the different student-based funding, that headcount and FTE that I mentioned, and then 15% still looking at institutions performing and being measured on that performance, but a relative performance, and that going down to 15% of the total pie. And really that was to make sure that we were recognizing the student population in which we are serving. And so now I'm going to turn it back to CFO Vitone to go through the numbers. Thanks.
Thank you again, Chris Fatone, Chief Financial Officer for the record. Slide 49, as the Chancellor mentioned, the Formula Committee's recommendations really came down to just a couple that impacted the distribution of and the calculation of the formula for the system. One of those adjustments is the adjustment to the small institution factor to increase both the threshold for a small institution, and also to increase the rate to recognize the inflation since the formula was first implemented. Now, the increase from $30 to $40 might appear arbitrary. That was actually determined looking at the higher ed price index for the time period the formula has been in place, and then suggesting from there tying the rate to the higher ed price index in the same way we do with registration fees and non-resident tuition. And for that, we are using the same rate, which then reflects that same lag. So we're using the same fiscal year higher ed price index inflation figure in both our rate setting for student fees, but also for the small institution factor. And this slide summarizes that effect. Again, because of raising the threshold to 125,000, that does bring Western Nevada back into the equation there. And you see the change column, the second from the right, represents the full impact of that small institution factor recommendation, and the enhancement decision unit 146 in the far right reflects the 20% and 40% phase-in recommended that's included in the governor's recommended budget. And then the other recommendations from the committee really dealt entirely with the manner in which the portion of the appropriation that would be distributed through the weighted student credit hour model would be revised. And those recommendations were changing the distribution from being 100% based on weighted student credit hours to three components: the weighted student credit hours going from 100% to 75%, incorporating a student-based component at 10%, and then converting that performance pool carve-out from a 20% set-aside to a 15% component of the distribution that would be determined at the front end and allocated so that the systems did not have that uncertainty in their budget in the current year, but they were still being accountable for performance. So first, let me talk about the weighted student credit hour component. The one change in that model, so there was no change in how a weighted student credit hour was determined. So it is still the same population of credit hours. It's completions for resident students that are not F grades or withdrawals. The only change that the committee did recommend was in looking at the distribution to use to allow a little bit more stability in the distribution allocation by incorporating a greater of three-year average of weighted student credit hours or the most recent count year. So when we're looking at the weighted student credit hours for distribution now, we're looking at their 3-year average so that we're picking up not just the 2 count years, but also the even year in the cycle, and then comparing that to their more recent count with the greater of being a way to just reduce the level of volatility that the distribution model enters with the change looking just year over year, otherwise on a 2-year basis. This slide 51 demonstrates what that looks like. You see the actual counts for fiscal year 22 and 24. That would be how we normally would look at the change to determine the distribution. The third column is the 3-year average, and you can see where in this case Great Basin had a higher average over the 3-year period than their fiscal year 24 actual count. And so the highlighted cells are what we would use for determining the proportional share of the weighted student credit hours for distribution. So again, this is just for the distribution component. It's not changing the caseload adjustment, but it's just looking at how the weighted student credit hours would factor into the distribution. And the far right column is how that what that looks like in percentage of the total. The second component of the distribution recommended by the committee and brought forward and approved, recommended by the board, is the 10% student-based funding. And as the chancellor mentioned, this is part of what's referred to as a balanced approach. So it's 75% still being based on the instruction, delivery, completions. 10% is looking at just the student population. So it's recognizing that there are costs associated with the student for being a student, whether they're a part-time student or a full-time student, and that different populations of students also bring also encourage different investments in student services on the campuses. So the student-based funding component of 10% is looking at the headcount and FTE or credit hours as a measure of part-time students. So headcount looking at all students, credit hours as a way of adjusting for part-time, the part-time relationship, and looking at that student population as students, not with regard to completion. So this is the same population of students that goes into the weighted student credit hour model, except that we're not making adjustments for non-residents, we're not making adjustments for non-completions and withdrawals, because the students, in those cases, they're individual course completions. In this case, it's the whole student. So the student is a student. They may not complete all their courses, but they're still a student. And while it does include non-residents, the intention here is just looking at distribution. It is not, it's not a factor of the caseload adjustment that is really where the weighted student credit hours and resident students drive the caseload. So again, same population of students, just looking at the entirety of the students. The other recommendation from the consultants that work with the committee was not just to look at 1 year data, but also to look at 3 years data as a way of, again, smoothing the effect of distributing on this proportion. So this slide 53 is just showing the total population of students that goes into this calculation for each of the institutions. And each of these columns represents a 3-year accumulation of the head counts and the credit hours. And you'll notice the 3 categories of head count and credit hours that are being taken into consideration. These were based on, again, the recommendations of the committee looking at national best practices. The box on the far right, we take both of those calculations. One's looking at head count purely, the other's looking at credit hours purely. The box on the far right is just taking the average of those 2 averages. So at the end of the day, the student-based component is distributed based on that box on the far right that is looking at the average of head count and credit hours in the 3-year total of those various categories across the institutions. And the third component of the distribution is the outcome-based funding, which, again, this is the recommended replacement for the performance pool carve-out. It is performance-based. This is based on the same performance measures that were in the performance pool. So this is completions. There's a measure of efficiency with regard to completions per 100 student FTE. There's also workforce and economic development factors looking at STEM completions and looking at certain targeted area completions with each institution. Each institution has 7 factors that go into their performance measures. Those measures, again, are not changed under this proposal between the performance pool carve-out in the prior formula and the performance-based funding in this model. They're the same measures. The change is rather than having the funds set aside and have to be earned back through the performance hitting targets, we're measuring relative performance. So the relative performance relative is measured in 2 different ways. It's relative to the institution's individual completion, so looking at their year-over-year performance or measurement year-over-measurement year performance, and then how that performance, so it's that relative performance year-over-year rather than target, and then that relative performance relative to the other institutions' relative performance. And I know that is a lot of relatives, and we'll see more. It's also a lot of calculations on the next slide. I'm sorry, I skipped this one. I think I already explained all the specifics on that change. This slide 56, I know there's a lot of math on this slide, and I really don't like presenting it. But this is the math that goes into calculating what relative performance means. I will walk through it just again to explain in the numbers. The far left column, we start with the actual performance allocations from the most recent cycle. And so what you have in column A is the performance fund set aside from fiscal year 25. The next column B is the distribution of that performance funding by institution. Column C and column D are the 2 measurement period performance points. So again, these are the performance measures for each of the institutions. It's their 7 factors for each of the periods, and it's comparing their year over year in column E. Column E is their individual institution relative performance. So it's how column D performed over column C. Now you might ask, why are we using fiscal year 23 versus instead of fiscal year 24? When we put this information together, the most recent data available is fiscal year 23, because we're preparing this in the summer of 24 before 24 data is complete. We're just completing fiscal year 24 measures in January of 25. That's when they're reported. So we're working with the most recent year. These are the same. This is similar to how the current formula works in terms of that lag because of the availability. But going back again, column E is that relative performance within the institution year over year. Column F is applying that relative performance to the institution's prior share of the performance fund distribution. And then column G is just normalizing the result of column F which is where the relative performance between institutions comes into play. So between column F and G, you're adjusting their individual performance year over year to how they performed relative to the rest of the institutions. So there is some interinstitutional competition for the performance funds in this model, in comparison to the prior model where the performance funds were set aside and the institution was only competing against their target. In this case, because the targets have been removed, they're now competing against each other in the relative performance model. The nature of the calculation is intended to account for that performance while also kind of limiting the volatility of the performance measurement. And again, I apologize because I know there's a lot of math on that slide, and you may have questions that I'm happy to take later when we get to the questions. Slide 57 is what that all looks like when you put it together. So there's the recommendation was to move the model away from 100% being distributed on weighted student credit hours to this proportional distribution called the balanced approach. And it's the three components that we just went through: the weighted student credit hours, first going from 100% to 75%, the student-based portion at 10%, and the relative performance at 15%. And you can see on this slide how those three distributions differ across each of the institutions. And because they are weighted differently at 75, 10, and 15%, the far right column is just providing you what that weighting works out to in total. And so if you look at the allocation, when we run the allocatable appropriation through the distribution formula, that would be the effective rate of the distribution. Slide 58 summarizes what that allocation distribution looks like running the model. And this is also summarizing the enhancement request, E146, which is the request for funding to fund the results of the formula for the two-year institutions in Nevada State without a corresponding offset to UNR and UNLV, but also phasing it in at 20% and 40%. So the first two columns, again, are the results of the percentages that I showed on the prior slide when you run the allocatable portion of the appropriation through the formula. The allocatable portion of the appropriation is the appropriations less the small institution factor and the research O&M set-asides that are specific for those purposes. So it's the appropriations, it's the adjusted base appropriations for the formula budget accounts, less the small institution factor and research operation and maintenance set-asides. The balance of the appropriation goes through the allocation distribution formula. And first two columns are the results of that distribution if you just ran the formula for fiscal year 26 and 27. And again, this was this is the result of that formula redistribution. And as the Chancellor mentioned, the concern of the committee, the concern of the board, the concern of the institutions and stakeholders is the impact or the impact that would have on our R1 institutions, recognizing that while we understand and the intention of this formula work was intended to recognize the impact that the prior formula has had on the two-year institutions, the request that was advanced by both the board and the governor's office is to recognize that impact, but also recognize that funding for the two-year institutions and Nevada State University at the expense of the research universities didn't seem to be a gain, and instead would be a step back. And that's the reason for the request to be without offset. The phase-in, again, I think is reducing the impact in the initial years to allow additional time to further some of the follow-up work recommended by the committee. And I'm going to pause because I think the Chancellor wants to offer some comments.
Plus, I know you're tossing it back to me. So Patty Charlton for the record, and just just to be clear, recognize that this is a departure and it is a significant ask, but also wanted to recognize that the importance of the work that has come, and we've come a long way, but do recognize that it's a deep lift and a deep ask that we have, but think that it's important for the state and for our students and for where we're heading into the future. And so with that, I'm going to cover very quickly. The other thing that I did want to add that was an important part of the funding formula study and recommendation is that we would also, sorry, I can see myself on the screen, goodness, bad, is to be able to have an ongoing review process for the formula and not just wait every 10 years, which is what has happened, I think, historically, but to have an opportunity to bring back and tweak the formula as it is appropriate to make sure that it's meeting the needs, not just of the institutions and our students, but also for the state too. And so to bring those back on a regular and recurring basis. And so, and to do that organically as part of our ongoing work and not necessarily drive a whole new study. However, we would continue to work with this body in that regard. And so a few other one-shot items that we do have in our budget that have been included and supported in the governor's recommended. Number one, also I would call it a co-number one, the formula implementation, some of our cost of living, but also is safety and security. Safety and security for our institutions across the system, recognizing that we have challenges there and we do not have equal resources and infrastructure at all of our institutions. Our original ask, just so that you know, was really more around $50 million to help each of our institutions with one-time money based on the need that the institutions put forward for things such as locking mechanisms, such as cameras throughout the campuses, emergency phones throughout every institution, from Elko to Las Vegas to Mesquite, wherever we might be offering classes. And so there's an $11 million component that's been included in the governor's recommendation. Again, and I think you have heard from some of our faculty that, quite frankly, they hope that this can be increased, and so do we, and we know that we'll be back over time. And so this is also an outcome of a chancellor's ad hoc public safety committee that had representatives from local municipalities, faculty, our institutions, students, and other key stakeholders in emergency management following the very sad situation that happened at UNLV December of 2023. Our next item for recommendation is actually a continuation of the nursing expansion funding that this body so generously provided last session. It was $10 million annually, $20 million over the biennium. At the end of the 23 session, there was infrastructure work that needed to be done at each of our institutions. For example, hiring of faculty, recruiting of students, putting them into those cohorts, and it will take us really at a minimum 2 biennium in order for it to catch up to the formula, including in the weighted student credit hour and the revenue and receipts that are received. And so it's a continuation so that the institutions can continue that work and then have it embedded within the formula. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to CFO Vitone.
Thank you. And again, Chris Fatone, Chief Financial Officer, for the record. Slide 62, I wanted to discuss the maintenance unit, decision unit 204, the caseload adjustment for the weighted student credit hour value. As I mentioned in talking about our maintenance adjustments and caseload adjustment, historically the system's caseload adjustment was derived based on the change in the weighted student credit hours in the count year over the prior cycle's count year. We do our caseload on a look-back basis, so we are in the last cycle it was fiscal year 20 in comparison to fiscal year 18. 22. Fiscal year 22 in comparison to fiscal year 20. Thank you, Chancellor. And that was a time period that as you saw in the enrollment chart early in the presentation, we were, the system's institutions were recognized declined enrollments related to COVID. And so in the last cycle, there was a relatively significant negative caseload adjustment that was recognized there. In preparing the current budget request, looking at fiscal year 24, weighted student credit hours compared to fiscal year 22, there is an increase, and that was reflected in the initial maintenance adjustment. What we also recognize, though, because the legislature did not complete the formula distribution in the last cycle, the weighted student credit hour rate was not formally recognized, or it was not formally calculated as part of that closing. And the legislature directed us to work with the governor's office and prepare a budget request, determine a value consistent with the prior approach, and prepare our budget request accordingly. And so we were looking at that calculation, and we did review that rate. And in doing so, what became apparent was that the prior calculation would take into consideration the appropriations at the time of the budget closing. What the calculation did not take into consideration was the salary adjustment funds that are determined in a separate bill and appropriated separately. So the weighted student credit hour value that would be derived using the historical formula for our fiscal year 25 appropriations, because that's the period it would look at, would look only at the base appropriation and would not look at the authorized salary adjustment funds for the instructional budgets for that same period. And so working with the governor's office and reviewing the nature of the calculation, recognizing that fiscal year 25's total authorized appropriations would include those salary adjustment funds, the adjustment was added as additional maintenance for the caseload adjustment. And so saying that again, I think this represents essentially the cost of the salary adjustment on the incremental weighted student credit hours that are part of the caseload adjustment. And I have the next slide, slide 63, just to help kind of explain or demonstrate the difference in those weighted student credit hour calculations. Following the prior budget policy, you have the number that's on the top of the slide, and this is what's represented in our initial maintenance adjustment that remains in GovRec as a recurring maintenance adjustment or a recurring adjustment to base. And that is the derived value using the formula appropriations from the budget closing and the weighted student credit hours from fiscal year 22 that would derive that rate. The middle row is what's in our maintenance enhancement decision unit, and I'm sorry, not enhancement, our maintenance decision unit for the additional cost of the weighted student credit hour. And so what that adjustment is doing is just adjusting the closed appropriations under the initial budget authorizations and adding back the additional appropriations that are still part of those same formula appropriations that are now part of the fiscal year 26 base. So looking at it a different way, just in terms of seeing the relevant relative value, the bottom row is your FY26 governor's recommended base for the instructional budget. So this is before the maintenance and enhancement decision units. This is just the FY26 base that was otherwise based on the FY22 weighted student credit hour load and that weighted student credit hour rate. So using those same weighted student credit hours, that's the rate that would be derived before we applied caseload for the fiscal year 24 weighted student credit hour calculation. Again, the middle row there represents your M204 decision unit, which again in the amendments this has been moved to one shot, but this would be a recurring cost for the system in the caseload. This is the distribution by institution, similar to the M202 adjustment you saw in an earlier slide. Slide 65, moving on from the caseload related maintenance adjustment. Slide 65 is, again, this was our most significant request. Again, we wanted to thank the legislature for the very generous cost of living salary adjustments that were authorized in the 23 session. Those have been very important and effective in staff recruitment and retention, and it's very much appreciated. Nonetheless, the manner in which they're funded results in a significant deficiency on the system side. that the system did address in fiscal year 24 and 25 in making adjustments to correspond to the portion that was attributable to the other revenues within the budget accounts. As you might recall, in approving the salary adjustments for the system employees, the board took action in December of 23 that delayed the implementation of the cost of living for the system employees by 3 months, resulting in a savings in fiscal year 25 that went toward covering that gap, in addition to a 5% special fee increase that was approved by the board to also cover a portion of that salary adjustment increase, leaving the system institutions to make budget adjustments approximately $27 million per year in 25. Moving forward into 26 and 27, the fee increase continues, and so the bottom half of this slide, you can see the annual funding shortfall there, or the annual portion of the salary adjustments not funded through the general fund amount to about $63 million, of which $16 million is covered through the continuing of the registration fee increase that was implemented to address this beginning in fall of 24, leaving a remaining unfunded portion of $46.5 million that would be covered in part by the request in our recommended budget of approximately $28.7 million per year, leaving the campuses to make adjustments for the remaining unfunded portion of about $17.8 million per year. And slide 66 is just demonstrates the distribution of the salary adjustment request across the institutional budgets. And again, as mentioned, this enhancement has been moved to one shot. Wanted to provide some additional information because I know in terms of understanding the distribution of our salary and benefit costs and what costs are eligible for salary adjustment funds through the general fund in the appropriation. This slide 67 is a summary of the institution's salary and benefit costs. Early in the presentation, we had the pie chart that showed the full funding of all institution expenses, and the biggest component of that being salary and benefits. This is the same total salary and benefits for the system. Far left column is the salary and benefits that were funded through the state-supported operating accounts in fiscal year 24. And again, so this is funded with a combination of general fund and the other revenues that are in those budget accounts. The middle column is the other accounts we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, and the distribution of salary and expense there, with the total in the third column from the left. When we are talking about the salary adjustment funds that the legislature authorized and the request to add additional funds to cover those, we are only talking about the positions that are covered in the left side of this chart, not in the state budget accounts. None of the state appropriation or the requested enhancement is for positions in the non-state accounts. It's entirely within the state-supported budgets. And again, earlier in the slide, we had information about the position FTEs. This is fiscal year 24 actuals. We measure those in November 1st of each year. That just coincides with our National Center for Education Statistic reporting, the IPEDS report. That's when we report our employee headcount, our employee FTE for IPEDS. And so we use the November 1st reporting date just as a snapshot of actual. And this slide 68 is showing the distribution of those FTE across the funding sources that we talked about earlier. And again, on the legislature, the authorized salary adjustment funds from the legislature apply only to the state column in this slide. The last slide was FTE. This is that same information looking at the base salary costs of those positions. And again, this is measured on the fiscal year 24 actual. This is not total compensation. This is just base salary in these categories because base salary is what the salary adjustment funds are based on. So I just wanted to make that as comparable as possible.
Thank you, and for the record, Patty Charlton. I know we are almost done, I promise. Again, just wanted to say that we are very grateful for our employees for the generosity that did happen last session with the cost of living. We know that those were unprecedented levels, and I also want to highlight we are not looking for a policy change from this body. We recognize that we have an obligation to step forward. It's just been the size that was difficult. We have made some mitigating steps, as we mentioned, deferring the COLA, which was a one-time situation that we could realize, and then also to implement the fees on students. We are sensitive to increases in fees on students, as our students are as well. And so we look forward to continuing to work with your staff as we move forward through this process, and of course this body. Recognizing this is really focused on our operating budget, but did want to just take a few moments just to highlight some of our NSHE capital improvement process and our request. In the GovRec, we do have the $15 million of HEC, otherwise referred to as the Higher Education Capital Construction and Special Higher Education Capital Construction Funds. That has been included, which includes $3 million of the slot tax revenue and then $12 million of the rest. That is divided between our different institutions. We have just under 13 million square foot across all of our NSHE institutions, and we do have an estimated value, property values of our buildings of $7.6 billion, of which we have $376 million backlog in deferred maintenance. The next slide gives just a perspective of where we have sat with the state when it comes to capital funds from the 2021 session into where we are today. We have lost some ground. We recognize that the state has some significant needs in state buildings. Many of our institutions do not have any other pathway for even getting HVAC units replaced or a small culinary kitchen remodel. So we really rely very much on our partnership with the state in that regard. And then the next slides I'm just going to walk through very quickly, but our institutions are here. The following just represents the Board of Regents' priorities for capital for this coming session, both in obviously the HEC, which is our number one, which is part of what we have done for many, many, many decades, but also going through the projects. For example, right under the HEC, the number one priority was a small project at Western Nevada College. Also included in these charts for these priorities are planning dollars and some renovation dollars for projects, but also for, there is one large construction item through the end of the session in 2023. CSN did receive through a special appropriation planning funds for construction at their Northwest campus, and so that is moving through and is through construction documents anticipated by June. So that is included. You see planning again, maintenance projects, and then we also have in working in concert with State Public Works Board, some groupings of additional deferred maintenance, but you do also have the state fund request, the other agency request, and the total for each of those institutions. And so, and each of those projects, and we know that we have a hearing next week with
I was
Public
just going to
Works.
say,
No,
Chancellor.
we're moving on.
Okay, I was like,
All
you
done.
can skip this because we
Yep.
are going to be welcoming you back March 18th to go
Yes.
over these
Yep.
wonderful
And so
capital
I'm done with
improvement
that. That's how
priorities.
quick. And now we just have one final item regarding some proposed Authorization Act language, and that really pertains to some of the nuances that CFO Vitone shared.
Thanks again, Chris Fatone, Chief Financial Officer. The one thing we wanted to highlight, the one item we wanted to highlight in the request for Authorizations Act language relates to the additional revenue that was added to the UNR medical school budget account for the academic support payments that are received from their academic partner. And this request is just to align the treatment of those funds with the fee funds that are included, with the student fee and registration fee and tuition that are included in the budget accounts as well. So just wanted to highlight that here for you.
So, Chair Bacchus, that completes our presentation, and we know that there's probably questions. And again, I just want to also acknowledge that we have representatives, including our presidents and other experts at the campuses, should there be the need. We do have President William Kibler in Las Vegas, and so he's the lone individual in the Las Vegas room, should he need to come to the table. Thank you. I believe that's him, or it might be Doug Unger. Sorry, I think the president was hoping to get here, but we do have representation from CSN.
I do want to thank you, Chancellor and CFO Fatone, for your comprehensive presentation, and as well as welcoming, obviously, our various institutions here today and their representation. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and start with questions and see how far we get along, because obviously we have some other matters, including floor, that we will eventually have to get to. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with Assembly Member Torres Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much for joining us and for that very brief overview of the NCHI budget. I guess now I know that maybe never let NCHI or any professors get a collection of slides together, but we do appreciate the overview. I did have a question. I think on slide 19, you talked a little bit about teacher preparation programs and how we've seen an increase in teachers being trained in these programs. So my first question, last legislative session, the money committees did adopt a policy and approved general fund support for summer courses for teacher education programs. What impacts has this funding had on programs and the institutions and their summer school offerings for educators throughout Nevada?
Thank you so much, Assemblymember Torres Fawcett. I'd like to ask the institutions to come forward if I could, because I think they really represent their institutions best. So that would be primarily UNLV, UNR, and Nevada State University primarily. Thank you. And they don't all have to rush, but UNR, UNLV, and Nevada State, please.
Good morning, Darian Pollard for the record, President, Nevada State University. Good morning to each of you. Thank you, Assemblymember, for the question. I think Nevada State has done some particularly deep work in this space. In particular, our summer enrollments grew significantly through our School of Education because we've had the opportunity to expand some new coursework, particularly in secondary education with the specialization of bilingual education. That's allowed us to be able to do some deeper work in preparing teachers in that space. I'll also share with you that we have had a profound impact in the number of graduates that we've seen come through, both in our secondary education program and also in our elementary education program. I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but I will have them probably in the next 5 seconds. They will let me know exactly the numbers that you're asking for. But going to your broad question, those investments have made significant impact in both our education programs and in our summer offerings, which have allowed us to expand those pathways.
Thank you. And
You're welcome.
I apologize, President, but you mentioned specifically the bilingual education program, and I think
Yes.
also elementary ed.
Yes.
So were that specifically from the summer programs that were
Yes,
offered?
so summer programs. So we've
you.
been able to increase enrollments because we actually have faculty who could teach in those programs.
Thank you. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
that.
And also, Assemblymember Torres Fawcett, I apologize, but also Great Basin College has a pretty significant education program.
Good morning. Thank you for that question. Chris Heavey, officer in charge of UNLV for the record. We're excited to have this additional funding to be able to support students to fill in the teacher pipeline. Our records indicate that we're able to help 30 undergraduate and graduate teacher candidates complete degrees in the summer of 2023 and 2024 with the additional funding, as well as 47 candidates in the ARL program received additional assistance in their master's program, and then we had about 30 teachers, 15 each summer, in the ELL master's program who were able to receive additional funding. So it's definitely having significant impacts in helping students move through these courses in the summer and get into the classroom more quickly. Thank you.
Good morning. For the record, Dr. Amber Dinelli. I'm the president at Great Basin College. We have a teacher pathway program. We during the summer added additional teaching program classes, and we are also building pathways for students. In our rural areas, one of the things that we focus on is growing our own. So we work directly with our superintendents at all of our schools to build these pathways and identify students early on, even in the high school setting, who are interested in becoming teachers. So many of the courses that we offer during the summer also have added to basically building up the enrollment within those teacher education programs. The other thing that I would just offer is the funding that we've received from the state to add to our paraprofessional certificate program. And we're hoping that that will also assist us in leading those individuals into our teacher program. Thank you.
Good morning. For the record, Jeff Thompson, Executive Vice President and Provost of the University of Nevada, Reno. Assembly member, thank you for the question. We have increased the number of upper division courses and graduate courses that we teach in the summer in response to the funding support. We have been advertising and creating programs so students can graduate more quickly and get through the programs more quickly. We also are using the funding to make sure we have the faculty members to teach the courses in the summer. We do not have as impressive results as some of the other institutions do at this time, as we're advertising and creating interest in students to take summer courses, which they've traditionally not done. But we certainly appreciate the support, and we know we're going to be able to build the pipeline.
Thank you. And I do have another question, Chair, if that's all right. Kind of switching gears a little bit, but for each institution that offers the dual enrollment programs, what is the estimated percentage of weighted student credit hours that are attributed to dually enrolled students?
Thank you, Assemblymember Torres Fawcett. For the record, Patty Charlton. I'm going to ask the institutions to come up. They may not all have that readily available. We would be happy to work with the staff and provide specific information, perhaps even over a trend of years.
Good morning, Darian Pollard again for the record. And this I have extensive numbers on, Madam Assemblymember, so thank you for the question. Nevada State has seen a significant increase in our concurrent enrollment, and we make that distinction because we use high school faculty to teach those programs. We take great pride in that. About 26% of our credit hours are anticipated to be from concurrent enrollment. We've seen a significant increase of about 400% since 2017. And I think this speaks a lot to the intent of this program. If the intent of dual or concurrent enrollment programs are to increase both the pipeline into higher education and then also the participation and those who actually earn the credential, we're seeing a good investment in this space. What particularly is important to me about this is that about 1 in 3 students who are first-time, full-time students at Nevada State are formerly concurrent enrollment students. That's a roughly a 282% increase in the last 3 years from Nevada State. I'm particularly proud of the fact that about 52% of our NSU concurrent enrollment students are subsequently enrolled who are also Pell Grant eligible students. So about 57% are first generation, and also 86% come from historically minoritized populations. So for us, I would offer to you that we've seen a significant return of investment by the state as it relates to this program, and that we also know that our continuing or concurrent enrollment students were 10% more likely to graduate within 6 years. That's something I think is commendable and something we should work to expand deeply. Thank you.
Good morning, Kyle Dalpy, Western Nevada College, with some numbers from our world. Our overall enrollment from the 2 benchmark years, FY22 to FY24, which is what you're seeing on the caseload increases on the slides, overall was up 17%. That's the largest enrollment we've had in more than 12 years, the biggest increase we've experienced recently, and a big portion of that is in the dual enrollment space. And so for from fall of 22 to fall of 24, we increased the head count of students by 60%, but the weighted student credit hour amount is 46% increase of our overall increased enrollment. And so again, significant number of new high school students made up our overall head count, and as well as our weighted student credit hours.
Hi, this is Chris Heavey, Officer in Charge, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Thank you for that question. We've also seen substantial growth in our dual enrollment programs over the last few years. It's not as high a percentage for us at UNLV as it is at, I think, some of our sister institutions. We're less than 2% of our weighted student credit hours are in the dual enrollment space, is my estimate, kind of doing the math. We're up over 2,100 students as of fall 2024, and typically taking 1 to 2 classes each semester in the dual enrollment space, but we're such a large institution, it's a fairly small percentage of what we're doing, and still also a small percentage of the growth that we've seen at the UNLV campus. A lot of our growth has actually been driven at the graduate student level. Thank you.
For the record, Dr. Amber Dinelli, President at Great Basin College. Obviously, GBC is kind of unique. We have multiple campuses all over rural Nevada. And so I tell you that our average right now for dual enrollment is 28%. That's up 24 was last year about where we were at. But what's unique is that at our different campuses, I would just give you a picture of what this looks like. Pahrump, we have about 22% is dual enrollment. In Winnemucca, we're at 24. In Ely, we're at 52%. That's probably largely because the superintendent in Ely, anything that he can offer his students in that rural community, they are after doing. And so we support them through dual enrollment from all the way from construction to physical therapy and everything in between. And then in Elko, we're right around 35%. Thank you.
So good morning. For the record, Jeff Thompson, Executive Vice President and Provost at the University of Nevada, Reno. Assembly member, to your question, certainly we have seen significant increase in the number of students in dual enrollment at the University of Nevada, Reno. For the reporting year of FY24, we went from almost no students in dual enrollment to over 3,000 in dual enrollment. This is an effort that we have worked with the school districts to make sure dual enrollment is available at a number of schools where it was not available in the previously. And we have expanded into Washoe County and Clark County significantly in these areas. As a percentage of our overall weighted student credit hours, it's still a very small percentage because of the size of our university. But on average, each student is taking about 2 courses from us of those 3,000, so 6,000 weighted student credit hours. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, that's not quite the right calculations. It's a little different. It's 6 credit hours per student times 2, so yes. Thank you.
For the record, Rolando Mosqueda, interim CFO, College of Southern Nevada. Looking at the 2020-2021 academic year, CSN had 5,960 students enrolled in either a concurrent or dual enrollment program. In 2022-2023 academic year, we were able to expand enrollment to a little over 7,200 students. And the most recently completed academic year, 23 and 24, CSN leveled off at 6,500 students approximately in our dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment programs. With regards to specific weighted student credit hour, I can get back to you on what that would be. But I can tell you that the dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment students comprise about 13% of CSN's total student population. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Karen Hilgerson, president of TMCC for the record, and I apologize for the sunglasses. I mean no disrespect. I just had eye surgery yesterday, so my eyes are pretty light sensitive right now. I will say that at TMCC, our dual enrollment programs continued to trend up, and I would call it a cautious trending up. So we're at about 2,400 enrollees. And just to clarify, there's many different types of dual enrollment programs at TMCC. We have TMCC High School, which is embedded dual enrollment. We have a great program with ACE Charter School that is technical dual enrollments, and that's where we really see the benefit of the weighted student credit hour, because several of those programs are a factor of 4. Without that, we wouldn't be able to afford these programs. So that is really, really quite helpful. And we have other partners too, including Washoe County School District, where we continue to do our Jump Start, which is where we send a qualified adjunct faculty or full-time faculty member to the high school. And we're expanding concurrent enrollment, particularly within the career technical ed space, where many of the high school teachers are highly qualified to teach some of those technical programs. So we're strategically trying to expand in that area so that we can really produce excellent tech ed workforce graduates. I will also say that I think we do a wonderful job with our customer service, really trying to do our best by the parents and the families whose children are truly benefiting from this excellent program. So I think that's probably all I got for you today, and I think it's a great question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just kind of wanted to follow up on that. If you do, Chancellor, want to get us that like specific information of the estimated number or percentage of weighted student credit hours for the institutions, that'd be great. And that's what I'd be curious to see. And I thought it was nice that President Pollard noted of those that take the dual enrollment or the current students, how many of those were former dual enrollment students? That was quite intriguing, that 1 in 3 at Nevada State University was. That was an interesting fact today. With that, I have the next question. I wanted to confirm, and this would probably be for CFO Vitone, it pertained to one of your slides, 63 specifically, but we don't need to go up to it. I just wanted to confirm, because the data you were using there was fiscal year 24, and this was for the weighted student credit hour rate of being $208.99. I want to make sure that is the weighted student credit hour. I know at the end we may be doing some technical adjustments, but I want to make sure we're on the same page as to that dollar amount.
Sure, Chris Fatone, for the record. The weighted student credit hour rate that would have been derived in closing the fiscal year 25 budgets was actually the fiscal year 22 weighted student credit hours. And so to be consistent, this rate, because the base is still based on the FY22 weighted student credit hours, because we don't get into the FY24 caseload adjustment, that's maintenance on top of the base. So the rate is actually still based on the FY22 weighted student credit hours.
Okay. I just want to make sure we're utilizing that same figure. The governor had submitted an amendment to remove the funding of the M204 decision unit, as you noted in one of your slides, that it was going to go as a one-shot. I believe you also mentioned that this would definitely be something that should be on a recurring basis going forward. And so my question is, if the funding and decision unit M204 to increase the weighted student credit hour value used for caseload is approved, please confirm whether that funding would be considered a one-time in nature and therefore removed from the base budget for the 2027-29 biennium.
Chris Fatone, CFO, for the record. I think it remains our interest for this to be recurring funds. I understand that it's recommended, or it's been amended to one shot. Certainly how that is incorporated in the next budget build, we would hope to have the support of the governor's office for that to be built into the recurring base at that time.
And I appreciate that response. Thank you. Next, we will go to Chair Dondera-Luke.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I have a couple questions, if you don't mind. I want to discuss the dedicated research space at UNR, and I was wondering, how did UNR identify that additional dedicated research space to be funded through the M202 unit that is currently supported in non-formula state-supported budget accounts? And are there equal reductions recommended within the non-formula budgets as a result of that to fund the M202 costs?
Good morning, Chair Backus, Senator Dondero Loop. For the record, Andrew Klinger, Vice President, Administration and Finance at University of Nevada, Reno. So that the process for identifying that is there's a classification system for research space, and so we use that classification to identify space. This is the first time we've included non-funding formula space in that, and so what we've done is we've adjusted out of that, so the number has gone down from what was originally submitted. That adjustment was to recognize the recharge that we do. So some of that is currently funded, so we reduced it down to, it's 104,000 square feet of space that was left unfunded, and so that's the adjusted number is based on that. I don't know if that answers your question.
So then will you confirm that the recommended general fund appropriations in that unit M202 for increased research space funding at UNR can be reduced by approximately 1.1 million in each fiscal year?
I believe that is the correct number.
Chris Fatone, in terms of reduced from the original request, yes, that is reflecting the amount that is currently
So it'll
funded
be
through the formula.
1.1 million in each year?
Yes.
That's correct.
Okay, Madam Chair, thank you very much. Happy birthday, Mr. Klinger.
Thank you.
What a way to spend it with us.
And with that, our next question is from Majority Leader Howdicke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have a couple of questions, if that's okay. You did answer some of the questions I had through the presentations, and I just want to get a little bit more information. Most of it's going to be on the new funding formula. You talked about the phased in of the new funding formula, and I saw that in our notes that the hold harmless for UNR and UNLV is recommended. Well, I guess my clarification is the hold harmless for UNR, UNLV recommended as a one-time funding for this biennium? Or, and if you could answer that and then let me know if it's not, could you go through that timeline with me of when we will be fully implementing that new funding mechanism?
Certainly. For the record, Patty Charlton, Chancellor, Nevada System of Higher Education. Thank you so much, Assembly Member Speaker Howdicke, for that. Our recommendation and our request really is that this is an implementation cost. It's really important, I think, for our state and for our institutions that we can, it would be a new investment, but that time would be over multiple bienniums. And so we would want to work with both this body as well as with the Governor's Finance Office and the Governor's team on what that might look like. So we have small incremental costs right now. We also recognize, and I will tell you, I know that this is a big ask. I recognize that, but recognize it as 20%, 40%, and what that might look like. It may take multiple bienniums. We'll come back with reviewing the formula and what that might also look like. The other thing I did want to also add that was part of the charge to the Chancellor from the Higher Ed Funding Committee is to really look at an adequacy study and an equity study, and that is underway right now. That was an outcome of, we didn't have sufficient time during the actual funding committee's work, but it is an ongoing process, and we are in the midst of that right now and anticipate having that completed probably in the next month or so, and so we'll also be able to share that information. I think there was some inquiry during testimony last session that was an important factor. It didn't get into the scope of the bill, but we are continuing to do that, and the system has funded that on our own. I hope that answers your question.
And one last question on the funding formula. I know you had mentioned that the old formula was unfair to the smaller institutions, and so can you talk about, just give us a little bit more details about how this new funding formula brings equity to the smaller institutions?
Certainly, and so for the record, Patty Charlton, and thank you for that question. And so I think the main area in which that addresses is to recognize that significant differential of student population. That part-time student, at many of our institutions, that represents about 75% of their students. And so it really shores up that support. Every student needs and should be meeting with an academic advisor, for example. It also recognizes the percentage or those numbers of students that are also Pell eligible, which is also a very high level at a community college in particular, through being able to support those students through other services such as financial aid and financial literacy and all the other components. And so it's really a very tailored approach to make sure that our institutions have those resources to support the students to ensure that they can be successful through student support services.
Thank you, and I just have one last question for you. So I know our current budget policy excludes non-resident students from general fund components of the formula, and 100% of non-resident tuition is accounted within the state-supported budget to support the cost of their instruction and supplies. But for this biennium, it looks like non-resident students are included in some of the metrics to redistribute general funds. So through the new distribution model. So can you just give us an explanation as to why?
Certainly. So for the record, Patty Charlton. And so we are not including the weighted student credit hour in that calculation or the largest component of the formula, which is 75%. However, students are still supported. And so it's in that advising. It's in, for example, our offices, our registrars that process visas or other types of support. So it's recognizing that the student themselves needs to be supported. 100% of the revenue from non-resident tuition does go into the state-supported operating budget, and we're not asking for any policy change as counting the weighted student credit hours from those non-residents. It's just recognizing that we're supporting all students from that student support services mechanism. I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We will go to Senator Scheibel.
Thank you so much. I also have some questions about the weighted funding formula and the small institution factor, and specifically looking at, I think it's decision or budget section E145. It looks to me like we're utilizing this new funding, this new weight for the smaller institutions to cover fixed overhead costs, but we're phasing it in. So why would we phase in the increase for a fixed cost?
Thank you, Chris Fatone, for the record. Thank you for that question. I think the simplest answer to that question is just that that phase-in approach was applied to the comprehensive requests around the applying the new formula recommendations. It wasn't the thought that there would be, lower fixed costs in the initial 2 years. It's simply a matter of the approach taken in making the recommendation to incorporate the additional funding and applying it consistently on both components of the phase-in of the formula.
Okay, so I'm still not sure I understand the benefit of a phase-in approach, unless you're trying to say that we're saving money by phasing in.
Chris Fatone, for the record. I think additionally to that, I would suggest that one concern in doing a phase-in is to allow time for the ramp-up for the additional funds to be allocated and handle things that may be associated with that. So if you're going to fund additional positions, it gives you an opportunity to actually get those position recruitments established and launched. And so you may not need 100% of the funds on the first iteration. But to your point, the fixed costs aren't lesser in the initial years, other than the likelihood of having a ramp-up time.
Okay, and so then I have an associated question. You did mention, for example, adding new positions, but what other ways would the new formula benefit, like our smallest institutions, like Great Basin College? I think Great Basin and Western Nevada College are the smallest, and so if you could speak to that a little bit.
Certainly. For the record, Patty Charlton, I'm going to ask President Dalpy and President Dinelli to come to the table, please, to answer that question. Thanks.
For For the record, Dr. Amber Dinelli, president at Great Basin College. Thank you very much for the question. Because we are limited on the amount of funds that we have, that phase-in approach is going to impact us. It doesn't mean that those costs are going to go down, and so we will likely start off with this new formula in a deficit around 250, 270,000. For us, that's 3 to 4 positions that we will not be able to fill or grow. And so it is just one of those things that we know that if you look at the 40%, the following year, all of a sudden you see that deficits start to come together and we're about even. And then the hope would be that eventually, if it continues to be phased in, we would start to get to that point where we actually have a larger revenue stream that will allow us to grow. And in the meantime, we heavily rely on grants from the state. We rely on federal grants and funding that come to us in order to build and expand. But that's a cliff. It's not sustainable. And so we fully support this new funding formula because we know eventually it will benefit us. It's just the start of it with this phase-in approach is going to be a little rough. Thank you.
Hi, good morning again. Kyle Dalpy, Western Nevada College. We too agree the road ahead for the funding formula. I also appreciate the discussion that has to talk about how we define small institutions, because Western is in the space where we have outgrown the small institution factor under the current formula, the original formula, because we're over the 100,000 student threshold, yet we are still a small institution. And so moving that up to a 125 where we can recapture some funds for the overhead administrative costs benefits us. And then that increase from the $30 to the $40 helps us out as well. The money that we garner from that at a small institution goes to pay for the standard overhead that we need. Every school under our accreditation needs to have a certain level of services. And at the small institution, it's the same level. We have to have a CFO, we have to have an advising department, we have to have an admissions. It's all outlined. And so the cost is different. We don't benefit from an economy of scale of what I would consider larger enrollments. And so we are happy that is being phased in rather than just saying no. And, of course, if we could have 100% would be great, but we understand these are all pieces to a puzzle that have to go together, and we're looking down the road. I'll give you a quick example. With our enrollment growth last session, or at FY24, when we went up 17%, that took our advising ratio from 351 students to 1 advisor, which is considered a best practice and is what our Board of Regents has asked us to hit as a target, to 651. Yet, when it happened in 24, there were no new caseload funds available. And so the overall weighted student credit hour caseload plus the small institution factor will help me going forward to support student success in that realm, and also being able to offer classes through our letters of appointment, adjunct instructors, as well as shore up our infrastructure, which is suffering when the chancellor mentioned the deferred maintenance of, I forgot how much it was, but the $15 million allocation that we get every session for the entire system. I have $22 million alone at Western Nevada College, and we are one of the 2 smaller schools. And so all of it helps us as a small institution. Thank you.
And if I could, just a brief follow-up. Dr. Dinelli, you mentioned that you would be in that deficit of about $250,000 to $300,000 in the first year. I'm not sure if that's the same for Western Nevada College or similar. I am trying to look at these charts, but I think it's faster just to ask you. What I'm getting at is, does that actually mean laying off faculty or delaying hiring faculty?
Thank you for the question, Dr. Amber Dinelli, president at Great Basin College. I would tell you that we have experienced some enrollment growth in the fall. We have an additional 500 students. We also have captured our summer school in increasing in enrollments and have kind of forecasted and planned for that. And so we'll be able to cover that gap as this is being phased in. But it doesn't allow for us to grow unless we utilize funding that comes in through any of those state or federal funds.
So, and Kyle Dalby for the record, Western Nevada College. Ours is a little bit different situation because under the current model, the current funding formula, we would not qualify for the small institution factor. And it's not, it's needed money, it's not bonus money, but to step us into that higher level of the formula will help us get to that gap, get some of those services and things accounted for as we go forward. And so it'll help shore us up. And part of that too, just to note one piece that's buried in the presentation, I forgot which slide, but when we look at utility costs alone going up 2 years ago, 46%, that has an impact on us. We run 3 campuses at 12,000 square miles, 3 cities, very, very thin staff and things like that sneak up behind us. And so the extra funds help and we appreciate it. Thank you.
Next, we'll go to Chair Monroe Moreno.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I have 2 questions, if that's okay. At the December 5th, 2024 Board of Regents meeting, there was a policy update that it's professional staff and salary schedules, and I'm sorry, I'm moving into the compensation for state-funded positions. I apologize. For the staff salary schedules, and could you confirm whether there will be a fiscal impact to the state-supported budgets resulting from that meeting? I think it was a recent approval of approximately 4% increase for NCHE's academic and administrative faculty positions that will go into effect on July 1st of this year. Sorry.
Thank you for the record, Patty Charlton, Chancellor, and so thank you for the question. That policy that is included in our Board of Regents handbook is for our professional faculty, which are outside of the state system, and so we do not anticipate a significant fiscal impact on the change of a schedule. It helps to guide our new placements for new individuals that come into the system, but there would not be a request on any changes for our salary schedule to this body, even for incremental. It would really capture anyone that falls below the current schedule, which because of the generosity of the COLAs, that has really outpaced at least existing employees. There may be 1s or 2s, but the institutions would address those.
Just a follow-up. Thank you. So is there an expectation that these increases would be covered in total or in part by general funds from the state? What's that fiscal impact to the general fund?
So for the record, Patty Charlton, thank you for that question. So I'm going to start the response, but have CFO Vitone weigh in as well. So if a position is funded on state-supported resources, either in total or in partial, a portion of that, if there was an increase, which again, we don't anticipate much in the way of anyone being impacted by the salary schedule adjustment, that would be a part of our combination of general fund and tuition and fees. But again, we're expecting a very minimal amount. But any increase that happens outside of the state-supported has to be absorbed by that revenue stream, which is independent of general funds. So I'm going to see if CFO Vitone can respond.
Thank you, Chris Vitone. Thank you for the question. Within the state-supported operating budget, so let's say a position is fully funded through the state-supported operating budget, that base salary, if that position's base salary was below the new minimum of the salary schedule, that's the only situation where we would increase the salary because of the salary schedule change. Otherwise, as the Chancellor mentioned, the salary schedule is just used in looking at initial placement of new hires, and more importantly than the salary schedule, they're also looking at market salaries and making those placements. So there's not expected to be a direct impact other than those minimum salaries that might have to be brought up, and that would be an adjustment to the base salary for the specific position that the institution would have to fund within their state-supported operating budget by making adjustments on other budgeted positions. So we don't have a request for an increase to the appropriation to address our salary schedule change. It's expected for the position budgets to be managed within the appropriations that they are managing already.
Thank you. And then one more follow-up, ma'am. That would be it, I promise. So there wouldn't be an adjustment for this biennium, but could we expect there to be an adjustment to the base in future bienniums for this?
Thank you again, Chris Fatone. So I think that base salary would be reflected on the roster, but the general fund allocation to the appropriation unit would be based on all the factors that go into determining that appropriation distribution. So again, limiting by the spending limit or the limit placed on the agency in making the request to the governor's finance office, it would have to be managed within the allowable ceiling of the appropriation, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much. That makes sense. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Next, we will go to Majority Leader Canizero.
Good morning. Okay, can you talk to us a little bit, following up on some of that last line of questioning, can you provide a summary of the Board of Regents policy to award merit pay and how such awards are funded within the state-supported budget when those awards are approved?
Chris Fatone again for the record. Thank you for that question. The board's policy, so the board's policy requires a annual merit process for administrative and academic faculty, and under a policy implemented, I believe it was in 2019, that policy provides for a minimum 1% merit pool that, based on revision to the authorizations language that was approved, I think in that same cycle, the board, it was understood that 1% could be proportionally funded from the institution's allocated appropriations. Since that implementation of that policy, I think the merit pool process was followed for 2 cycles, and then as we might recall in the authorization of the fiscal year 25 cost of living adjustments, salary adjustments, the board actually set that policy aside for fiscal year 25. So at this point, there's been 2 cycles where the 1% pool was used. The 1% is determined at each institution level, looking at filled positions that are eligible for that merit process, and then the institutions establish a process for making the awards at the institution level. But the pool is determined consistently across the system, looking at the filled positions and the 1% of those base salaries only, and the funding is then allocated proportionally based on where the position is funded from. So if it's funded within the state-supported operating budget, it would be that 1% of that base salary pool would be funded from the appropriation. It would not necessarily go to it doesn't get distributed 1% to each eligible staff for a merit process. The 1% establishing a pool. The allocation of the merit to the individual positions is based on the merit process that's looking at performance and evaluation cycles at each institution.
So system-wide, how much total funding was approved to support the 1% merit pay increases in FY24 within the state-supported budgets? And of that total, how much of it is general fund appropriations?
Chris Fatone again for the record. To answer that exactly, I'd have to offer to bring that back to you. The math is 1% of the base salary of the filled positions. For FY24, I believe that would have been September. We used a period determined, arbitrarily selected September 30th of 2022 because let me think about the year, 2022. So in our system, we do calendar year evaluation cycles on which the merit is based. And that merit award that would be based on the calendar year evaluation is then effective the beginning of the next fiscal year. So giving you the time between the end of the calendar year and the start of the next fiscal year to complete the evaluations and merit process. And I think I'm going to get some help from the Chancellor on.
Certainly. So for the record, Patty Charlton, and thank you, Majority Leader Canizaro, we will bring that information back to you for the 24 year, including the calculation of the time frame and the reference point of how the merit pool was calculated and any other supporting information relative to that time frame. So we'd be happy to bring that back.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Madam Chair, if I may, I have a couple other questions. I want to talk a little bit about the funding formula. because I think in response to a question, I think from Majority Leader Hadigi, you mentioned that the hold harmless amount, while it is a one-time fund, we would probably expect to see that over time continue to exist and continue to be of a differing amount, potentially lower, maybe higher, depending on how that funding formula works out. And I just want to make sure that I have heard that piece correctly.
Certainly, for the record, Patty Charlton, Chancellor. So thank you for that question. And I would say that the implementation cost should be somewhat fixed. We can certainly bring information back to you, but yes, I do anticipate that this is an ongoing cost because of the implementation and consideration of the factors to support those institutions and not do undue harm to the research institutions. So I recognize it's a large and comprehensive ask, and just appreciate that factor.
No, and I appreciate that. I think, when we're talking about this funding formula, that more or less is something that we have done as a budgetary policy over time. We asked to sort of look into that, right, to address some of the different concerns that we had heard from differing institutions. And what we have been presented with, I think, causes me some significant concern, because we have a funding formula that was supposed to address the amount of money that we were putting into higher education institutions. And a way in which to reallocate those funds that would make sense and to address some of those concerns. Instead, I think what we have been presented with is something that, yes, reallocates all of those money, but then it says, in addition to that, we now also need these other pots of money in order to continue to fund the two largest institutions that we have in the state, so that they don't lose a significant amount of funding that I believe would be very detrimental to them and to our higher education goals and system in the state. What is the wisdom of us approving this funding formula this legislative session, knowing that this is not a one-time, we're going to come into this legislative session, approve this funding formula, approve this additional monies for UNLV and UNR, and then the next budgeting cycle and the next biennium, we're going to be able to readjust, and everyone's sort of going to move along this funding formula over time. Because my concern is, based upon your answers today, that what we have is a funding formula that is not working for two of the largest institutions here in the state.
Certainly, and for the record, Patty Charlton, and I would agree that, and I think if the presidents were all to come up, they would say that the funding formula didn't work for any of them as a whole. And so we were trying to get through the work of the Higher Education Funding Committee, and I think it was very difficult for the committee members as well to recognize that the formula was basically a distribution model that didn't recognize the complexities, and trying to find a way and recognizing that they didn't want to have any harm. They wanted to be able to support the institutions, and so there was a real challenge to that process. And so bringing the opportunity back to revisit the formula on an ongoing basis, including over this next interim, it could look differently. We could bring back recommendations that say, you know what, that maybe that wasn't the right mix, and so maybe that long-term picture could be somewhat different. But you are exactly right, and that was, I think, the concerns that that you heard about the funding formula really came from everyone, from students to the presidents to the faculty across the state. It's difficult when you're looking at it from a distribution mechanism and not being able to step back, which is why we also wanted to engage in this adequacy study and equity to look at what is the right combination of fees, because it doesn't mean that everything needs to be funded by the state. What is that contribution that we need to look at also with our student fees? It's not a popular decision. We have made a very public policy decision on trying to keep student fees as low as we can, but there is a challenge to that in looking at the resources that the institutions need. So I completely agree, and look forward to working with your team on how we can move this forward.
And I appreciate that, because I think some of what your answer is part of my concern, in that we have a funding formula that is being presented to us to implement through this governor's recommended budget that does not account for what would truly look like a funding formula. We weren't presented with a funding formula that said we should implement this as a funding formula. Here are all the different pieces that we have looked at. Here is how we would implement that, and thus we would need additional money. That would be a request that I think in this committee would make more sense to me. But what we're being presented with is a funding formula that is going to work for some institutions, but for the two largest institutions does not work. There is an acknowledgement of that implicit in the fact that we have these additional pots of money for the hold harmless, but it's not a hold harmless, which we have seen in other places, that is going to decrease over time. This is a hold harmless that probably just exists as some chunk of money, at least what we have this biennium, maybe more, maybe at some point it's a little bit less, but this funding formula does not work.
Chris Fatone for the record. I think the one thing I'd like to offer is that I think going into the formula committee work, the understanding of the concerns around the prior formula was that it was very effective at helping build the research campuses and have them help achieve the R1 status, but it didn't have similar benefits. The consequences were on the two-year institution side. So it was somewhat acknowledged going into the study that the two-year institutions were not benefiting under the prior formula, and so that became a challenge, I think, with any formula work that simply redistributed existing funds, because that would mean solving that concern would necessarily come at the expense of the two larger institutions, which was not seen as a benefit to the state or a benefit to those campuses.
But in some ways, that's exactly what we have, is a redistribution of those funds and then an acknowledgement that in doing that in the way that we have, we are leaving our two large research institutions out of the equation, and in a way that does not allow for this to be the kind of comprehensive solution to a funding formula that, if you are saying this funding formula does not work, the way in which we have traditionally budgeted does not work, we are equally now presented with a funding formula that does not work, and that could cost this state additional monies. And I am just struggling with, where do we end up in approving this? And then I think Chancellor, the rest of your answer, which was we should continue to bring forward different ways in which to do this. So are you asking us then to implement this funding formula with the acknowledgement that A, it does not work, and that B, we would expect in the next several biennials to see an evolving discussion on this, where again the funding formula is going to change in the next legislative session and potentially in the session after that and then potentially in the session after that? Why would we adopt this and not just figure out a different way to do this in the first instance, rather than change it now and then continue to change it for every biennium until we figure out how to make it work?
Certainly. For the record, Patty Charlton, and thank you for those comments and that feedback. So first, I would say that there were parameters placed around the formula study work. And so it didn't give that full open opportunity to really look at what the cost of education was, what that right mix would be. But what we did recognize is that there were incremental improvements that were really important for the institutions. And I would say we just had this conversation about the small institution factor. That was one area that incrementally needed to be made. There are other factors that the committee had asked for the research and to include that, for example, in the student profile. And I'll give an example of ensuring that we're counting also our students that are at the poverty level. Well, to define poverty, the only measure that we have right now is whether or not they're Pell eligible. We need to look at a much broader definition of what that looks like. First generation, it is a self-disclosed if a student is first generation, but we also recognize that there's additional resources and support that a student could benefit from if they're the first in their families to go to school. So one of the components that the formula committee did recommend is an ongoing and continual review. And so that is to make sure that we don't leave ourselves just stuck in a box and then wait for not a legislative ask, but to be able to refine this process. Given the timeframes and given the parameters that we had, I think making those incremental adjustments was important, especially for the colleges to recognize that there is a complexity with their full-time and part-time student load, that was completely lost. And to be honest, I was a part of the 2013 working committee, and we knew at that time when we walked away, this was going to cause some issues for those institutions. We elevated some of the components at our research institutions to ensure that that research component was included in the weighting of upper division, master's, and PhD, and we now have those two R1 institutions. That too was a distribution model, and so yes, this needs to be a work in progress. We need to continue to work, with your staff and with the institutions to really define where we need to go as a state in this support.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the extra time to ask some questions. I think this is an ongoing conversation. I am not convinced that this particular funding formula is doing us a lot of service, and I'm not really sure the direction to go from there. I understand that there are different parameters of this, but I am struggling with having us come in and implement this in our budgeting policy in the way that we've been asked to, and then what that looks like over time, with the very open acknowledgement that this is something that is not going to continue to work in this fashion. So we can continue to have that conversation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. We will go to Chair Dondero Loop.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I feel like I would like to hear from UNLV and UNR on this subject. And I feel like that that they're the ones that are taking the reductions. And so if they could come up and give us a little insight. And Dr. Heavey, thank you for being on the spot when you've just stepped in. So we appreciate you being here, and thank you for your information that you're about to give us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Dondero Loop. I'm delighted to be here to answer this question. Chris Heavey, Officer in Charge. For the record, this is a topic near and dear to my heart. And what I would do is sort of reiterate some of the Chancellor's comments about the constraints that were placed on the funding formula. And my summary, I think, would go back to the two slides that Chris Fatone showed in his presentation. One, which is the SHIO slide that shows that the net funding per FTE in Nevada is the lowest in the country. And so essentially all of our institutions are operating on a shoestring budget. The next slide that I would point to is the slide that showed the relative funding of 4-year versus 2-year institutions in Nevada, and what you compared to national averages. And what you saw on that slide was that there was a bigger gap between the national average of the 2-year institutions and the 4-year institutions. And so essentially, I think we go into this thinking that the 2-year institutions are more underfunded than the 4 institutions. What I would add to that as an important qualifier is that slide shows the average of just all 4-year institutions in the nation. We are R1 research institutions. If you looked at the R1 institutions, what you'd see, and I think Provost Thompson will agree with me on that, is that UNLV and UNR are equally underfunded as R1 institutions in the national context. And so essentially all of our institutions have a substantial delta between the national averages of our peer institutions and what we have available. And so we're proud that we were able to achieve R1 status. We often say that we're R1 institutions funded on an R2 level, and which is a very challenging thing to do, but we've, proud of what we've been able to accomplish so far. When I do my back of the envelope math for UNLV and think about the FTE versus the average national statistics for funding per FTE at R1 public R1 institutions, UNLV is about $120 million short every year compared to the national average of peer R1 institutions across the country. And so we're in a dilemma. We have a great deal of empathy for our 2-year colleagues who have struggled under the funding formula that existed, but ultimately it's sort of the net funding available to all the institutions is putting us in a challenging circumstance, and I think that's what we'll have to navigate going forward. And I'll let my colleague Jeff Thompson add any thoughts he may have.
Thank you very much, Officer in Charge. Jeff Thompson, Executive Vice President and Provost, University of Nevada, Reno, for the record. First, I do want to point out that we do acknowledge that there are differences at the R1 institutions and the community colleges and the four-year institutions in the relative cost to educate students, because the student populations are different and require different levels of support. I think it was clear from the study that the 2- and 4-year institutions do need additional support as they ensure that students can graduate and receive degrees and contribute to the economy. To Chris's comments, if you look at R1 institutions and national averages, and to a comment that was made earlier, there are a lot of different models on how to support R1 institutions, and I think the state does need to think about how we're going to do this going forward, because there are models that are based on student registration fees heavily, and some that are based on state support heavily, and different states use different models to fund their R1 institutions. To Officer in Charge Heavey's point, it is a struggle. We're in national competition to hire faculty and to retain our faculty, and it is sometimes a struggle for us to compete with other R1 institutions. I'm very proud of the work we do and the work we do together as institutions, and to use the support the state gives us as best we can to provide the education and the economic development that we are required to do.
And if I could just add one or two other things, just to reiterate a few things the Chancellor said. First of all, we're very grateful for the cost of living increases, which are making us much more competitive in being able to hire and retain high-quality faculty. And second, as the Chancellor said, the adequacy of funding study that was authorized with the additional funds that you had allocated will be very helpful in providing important context for this issue going forward for the whole state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll go to Assemblymember Torres Fawcett.
Thank you, Chair. I did have a question regarding some of the personnel adjustments. Can you explain why the recommended budgets, particularly for UNR, CSN, and TMCC, include substantial reductions in the base budget to the personnel expenditure category through a generic line item, and therefore those budgets lack sufficient base funding to support the total recommended staffing levels for those institutions?
Thank you, Chris Fatone, for the record. So I think you're referring to the adjustments that are made as part of balancing the agency request within the limits that are given to us by the governor's office in making our agency request. So the spending limit or budget limits for the appropriation. I think what you're seeing in those adjustments is actually a direct correlation to the request for the additional salary adjustment funds in the enhancement request that was moved to one shot. So because coming into this cycle, we started with a rebound from a negative caseload adjustment in the last cycle that's offset by a current positive caseload adjustment. Those are offsetting adjustments, and at the same time, the campuses had bridge funding in the current cycle that covered their enrollment recovery. But in order to balance against the limit established for each budget account, the campuses did have to make, in some cases, some topside, I'll call them topside adjustments, in order to keep their request within the limit of the general fund. And again, that goes into where the general fund's really being set based on those limits and then just being allocated through the formula for those formula accounts. But those adjustments you're seeing are a direct reflection of the need that's represented in the request for the additional salary funds.
And for the record, Patty Charlton, Assembly Member Torres Fawcett, we have representatives from the institutions if you want to hear from them specifically about how they had to make those adjustments for balancing. Or we could follow that information.
I think that's good if the individual institutions could just get with us after the hearing. I know that we're short on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, we were just taking a look at those adjustments, and some of them are like in areas that you just wouldn't have expected. So it'd be great if we can get some follow-up on that from the institutions as to like those negative numbers. With that, we'll go to Senator Buck.
Thank you, Chair Bacchus. I'm looking at slide 35, and I see that it's kind of all lumped together. So I was wondering if you could give the committee breakdown as far as how tuition compares, student tuition, because it's all lumped together: appropriations, net tuition, education revenue, and federal stimulus. How do our state's student tuition and fees compare to other states? Just that aspect, because I know there was a 5% increase, but I wonder how we compare to other states. And along that same line, because you did increase the 5% to cover, I'm assuming the COLAs from last biennium, how much do you estimate that tuition and fees would have to increase in order to cover COLAs if the state or this appropriation is not funded?
Chris Fatone for the record. Thank you for that question. A good question on the makeup of the various components that are displayed in this chart, and I would have to bring that back to you. This is a published report, and that data is available, but I don't have that detail with me. And to your point, as I mentioned, this is FY23 data because there is a lag in the availability of it as it's collected and reported, summarized, and then reported back to us. So we're about to see the FY24 data, and so we may, depending on the timing, we may be able to provide that update at the same time. I've lost track on the rest of the rest of the question.
If the COLA is not funded, what's the percent? What's the amount of difference?
Page 65.
Yeah, so we've basically estimated that's about a 15% increase that would be required to cover the remaining unfunded portion.
With that, we will go to Speaker Yeager.
Thank you, Chair. I have two questions. The first part is a two-part question. And first, let me say thank you for your presentation. You might have covered this a little bit, but I want to talk about the 12% COLAs in 2024, 11% COLA in 2025. And the question is this. Given that those COLAs were given for professional staff, knowing that the institutions might not have sufficient resources to cover their proportionate share of the COLAs, why are you seeking additional general fund appropriations now to make the institutions whole? And then did the Board of Regents consider alternative options such as increasing registration fees and non-resident tuition that would cover the impacts of those COLAs?
So thank you. For the record, Patty Charlton. And so first, at the timing of the 12% COLA, there was, in fact, I think it was right at June 30th. It was a short window for the board to make some determinations. We actually convened a committee that was representative of faculty, institutional representatives, and students to look at options of how we could bring forward a plan to address the cost of living specifically for FY25. And from there, and from in the conversation with the students, and actually students overwhelmingly supported the need to increase registration fees because they were very supportive of making sure that the faculty and the professional staff received those adjustments. We worked with the business officers. We deferred the cost of living for FY25 for 3 months. So we actually didn't implement that until October 1st for professional employees. The 5% COLA or the 5% fee increase was actually in all categories, including non-resident tuition, and different from our other policies on registration fees where there's an allocation that goes between the state and the self-supporting, like capital improvement, for example, student government. All of those fees, with the exception of a small carve-out that went for financial aid for students, which comes back in the form of scholarships, grants, and other support for students. All of those funds are in the state-supported operating budget, including a non-resident, including our DE, including the registration fee. So all of those other fee categories were increased at that proportion to support the gap that was realized. And again, just for the record, we are not looking for a change in the policy as it pertains to the allocation that NSHE provides. It's just this was a very large COLA. If we were in the 2-3%, which we have seen historically, this would not be that conversation.
Great, thank you. And Chair, if I could follow up, I think you answered this question, but I just wanted to make sure for the record, and this is with respect to Decision Unit E 685. Just wanted to clarify that the funding recommendation in there is intended to be one-time in nature and therefore would not be included in the base budget for the 25-27 biennium.
Thank you, Chris Fatone. Thank you for the question. While that request was amended and moved to one shot, it was initially included in our request and supported as a enhancement with recurring funds. The amendment moving it to one shot does not change the system's request or need for that as recurring funds, and we hope to have the support of the governor's office in building our budget in the next cycle to include that. Should you approve it as well?
Thank you. We'll go to Assemblymember Hafen.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm going to touch on what Senator Buck and the Speaker just talked on, because I really do want to see the information that the Senator requested, specifically a chart of, how our tuition and fees compare to other states, because I do see slide 35, kind of the overall picture. We're bottom of the barrel. So I would love to see that before we get to closing so we can make some educated decisions. Specifically on what the Speaker just touched on, I think it's $57 million for us to consider. And I understand the Board of Regents made their decision to only increase the fees by 5% and then to come back and ask us to make up the difference. And it sounded like students also agreed that they should give the COLAs a 12%, but it sounded like they weren't willing to fund it. And so I'm just trying to make sure that I'm understanding all this correctly, because I do know that last session during the COLA and the pay bill, NSHE was specifically granted specific language that gave the Board of Regents the flexibility to do COLAs up to, and they were the only, I want to say agency, but aren't you guys like your own branch of government now? But that was the only category that we said that could go up to. Everybody else, it was mandatory. And I understand we fund NSHE a little bit different. We give you 100% of that instead of the 80% we give the other agencies. And so I'm just trying to get a better grasp on this $57 million for the COLAs and kind of get and I need additional information, so I'm sorry that we don't have that today. As the Senator stated, I really want to see where we rank in comparison on tuition side. I understand students don't want their tuition to go up, but at the same time, we have to be fiscally responsible with the state's dollars, and if decisions were made by another agency or branch of government, I want to understand everything, and I want to understand why those decisions were made, and now why they're coming back to ask us to fill the hole that basically they created.
For the record, Patty Charlton, thank you, Assemblymember Hafen. And so first, the 5% fee increase was an out of cycle. We talked earlier a little bit about what we call a predictable pricing. We've actually set fee increases out. It'll be published through 2029. So that 5% was in addition to other fee increases that were helping to offset other cost of instruction. And so we will bring all of the fee increases that were a portion of that. So some of that had already been put in motion probably 3 years before because of this tying our fees to what we call the Higher Education Price Index. And so I do know that there was sensitivity around that. NSHE is actually funded at a different percentage based on the amount of general fund and the student fee that comes into the budget. And so I think on average it might be 65% of the COLA, and recognizing that this was just, and we accept that, we're not asking for a change in the policy. It was just a significant portion. The board did approve to do the 11% in the second year as well as the 12 in the first year. We have other employees that were sitting, for example, our classified employees sit right there and wanted to be equitable, and also recognizing that it had been some time since salary adjustments had been made, and just with the cost of inflation, recognizing the plight of our faculty and staff as well. But we will bring all of that information back to you, as well as other fee increases that have been applied.
I would appreciate it. It'd be very helpful in making this decision, and thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Members, do we have any other questions for NG? I know they will be back, but okay. With that, we thank you today for your presentation. We can go ahead and close the budget hearing on the various items listed on our agenda today, other than our Richie that we heard earlier. And we will go ahead, and since people are leaving Carson City, I will start in Las Vegas with public comment. I can welcome up Mr. Unger if he's ready for public comment, and then we can allow people here in the audience to get situated in Carson City. So Mr. Unger, if you're ready to give public comment today, that'd be great.
Doug Unger, D-O-U-G, U-N-G-E-R, Nevada Faculty Alliance. Thank you, Chairs Bacchus, Tondera Loop, and members of the subcommittee for all of these lively questions today. I served on the Chancellor's Ad Hoc Committee on Safety and Security for more than a year following the December 6, 2023 mass shooting on the UNLV campus that murdered 3 of our faculty, 2 of whom I knew personally. We recommended 6 new training and education policies, and in addition, we discussed significant upgrades to safety infrastructure, all of which are going to cost significant money, and all of these recommendations were in the aftermath of failures and deficiencies we identified after the December 6 shooting. One is the replacement of all classroom and public space doors. They lock from the inside so our teachers aren't targets when they try to make the students safe. A new centralized communication system for NC's Southern Command so that we don't experience the same kind of chaos that happened on that day. Added numbers of campus police officers and staff so we don't leave some of our campuses unsecured during an active assailant incident. Added surveillance cameras coordinated and monitored for all campuses. You'll see in the Las Vegas Metro report that if we had had these cameras, we might have been able to save lives on December 6th. New technology AI systems that can detect only carried firearms. The governor's recommended budget calls for less than a third of what's needed. The safety and security of our colleges and universities must be a top priority. Please keep this in mind as you face so many Hobson's choices and difficult budget decisions this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we will come down up here to Carson City. Go ahead when you're ready.
Kent Irvin, ERVIN, Nevada Faculty Alliance. The Nevada Faculty Alliance has identified 4 highest budget priorities. First, funding to make our campuses safe and secure after the tragic events at UNLV now 15 months ago, as Mr. Unger presented. Second, the phased-in implementation of the new funding formula, which adds a component based on head counts, which is important for our community colleges with many part-time students. The hold harmless provisions are essential unless, of course, the state is willing to change from a distribution formula to a true funding formula that fully funds the cost of services to our students. Third, continuation of the historic and appreciated cost of living adjustments from the last session. The Regents already increased student fees by an extra 5% to cover about a quarter of the cost, but without state support, it will be necessary to hit students again by up to an additional 14% increase. That's the trade-off. Fourth, with inflation running at 3% or higher and employee retirement contributions rising by almost 2%, COLAs of 5% in FY 2026 and 3% in FY 2027 are needed for all state employees just to maintain the purchasing power of take-home pay. To be clear, a change in the NSHE salary study policy does not increase any current faculty salaries across the board. It only applies as a policy for new hires and a tiny number of employees who fell below the new minimum. Please refer to our written submissions for details. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, AVH will go to the phone lines for public comment. Is anyone on the phone lines wishing to give public comment today?
Thank you, Chair. If you would like to provide public comment, please press star 9 to take your place in the queue.
Good morning, Ian M. Hartshorn, Hartshorn, with the Nevada Faculty Alliance. Thank you, Chair and members, for your attention to the important information conveyed by Chancellor Charlson and her team today. The Nevada Faculty Alliance joins with the Nevada System of Higher Education in supporting the GovRec funding on last biennium's historic cost of living adjustments. After years of wage erosion, these COLAs have moved our higher education employees closer to our earlier purchasing power. The fact that these COLAs were designed to, quote unquote, catch up to inflation, however, has had real impacts on universities like mine. Funding approximately 65% of these COLAs may be fine in a normal biennium where a COLA may be in the low single digits. These historic catch-up COLAs, however, have led to major cuts. In my own department, we've had multiple searches frozen, meaning that I cannot staff the classes my students need to graduate. This is true across our campus, where the savings from retirees or departures for more lucrative jobs have been held back to cover budget gaps. We know without your intervention, the only alternative to this is even higher student fees, which the NC regions have already done once. We hope to balance access to higher education through affordability with the capacity to actually provide higher education by hiring and retaining skilled instructors. The funding outlined in the revised GovRec would allow our institutions to restore positions cut or canceled to ensure the COLAs were delivered. I ask you to support this important budget component, especially as higher education faces increased uncertainty at the federal level, and to avoid a situation where our students are paying more for less. Thank you.
Next caller.
Chair, there are no additional callers to provide public comment at this time.
Thank you so much for that. With that, I will conclude our hearing this morning.